Okay, let's get started. And before we get to the slides, let's take a quick look at our handout for the next 5 days. So everybody should have this set of handouts that you can add to your binder after the part 1. If you don't, then please see Karen in the front room. And it ended up running to more pages than I expected, so don't say I never gave you nothing. And it's laid out, as you might see from the table of contents, according to the progression of topics we're going to be looking at over the next 5 days. The opening weekend was to give us a context for our exploration of sacred geometry, looking at different aspects or fields within sacred geometry itself. And now here at the table of contents, we see that for the next 5 days, we're going to go into actual letters of the divine alphabet, the actual shapes that create functions in the world. And so to begin with, there's just one page about an overview of this divine alphabet that we talked about on Saturday. And then the next section is on the circle and the sphere. That's going to be our topic for today. The first letter of the divine alphabet is the circle and the sphere, which is nature's form for containing energy and consciousness. It's the primeval perfect form. And then the Taurus, the Vesica Piscis, and the 3 sacred roots, which we're going to deal with later today. Polarity and the I Ching. Then projective geometry and form drawing. Then the spiral and the vortex is going to come in tomorrow, leading to Fibonacci and the golden proportion, and 2D shapes. And 2D shapes include the shapes connected in various traditions to the elements of nature, called the tattvas in the Indian tradition, and to the Rosicrucian system of the shapes corresponding to the 4 different layers of the etheric life force. Then 3D shapes, Platonic solids, Archimedean solids, and a variety of topics connected with this. Then leading to our final day in dealing with the Earth grid itself and the concept of a modern temple science of earth healing. There's then a section, if you look at where you have a colored page insert, after these numbered pages, there's an unnumbered insert that we've been working on and hadn't gotten to numbering yet, but want to make sure you got it. That at the front says the 5 forms which create the physical world, the Platonic solids. Again, this is not listed on the front table of contents. This is a separate handout. And we constructed this to give you visual references to the Platonic solids and some of the forms coming out of it, and also connected to the Earth grid. So this is multiple pages showing different forms related to the Platonic solids and their interrelationships. And then discussions of the Earth grid that we're going to be getting into on our final day. There's also, one thing I want to point out is that on the last page of that section, on the back of a page, you see an article that at the top says, Recipe for Pure Water. Again, this is at the end of this section on the Platonic solids and such, before you get to Jane's section we haven't talked about yet. And this Recipe for Pure Water is the article that I'm going to be referencing on Thursday that many people have asked me for a copy of in previous courses that we've done that have to do with the way that we can alchemically transmute toxins out of water in particular, but generally any toxin can be transmuted in a particular process involving the metal palladium. Because we're going to be showing you how the metal palladium is connected to the form of the dodecahedron. And so when we address that on Thursday, people often ask for the article, and this is the actual article that is derived from New Scientist magazine. Then there is a handout by Jane with some of the information that she has and will be covering for you on squaring the circle, gematria and the Parthenon, and some other topics that we have yet to address. Jane has a lot to be doing with you in the next few days in actually being able to know how to directly draft and construct some of the fundamental forms and constants in nature and sacred design that I'm going to be discussing and illustrating for you in the slideshows over the next few days. And then as we get further on in the week, we're going to increasingly work more with the Zoom toolkit to construct things in 3 dimensions. So, was there anything I left out there, Jane, that should be? Okay. So at this point, we'll go ahead and start on our slides for the day on our first letter of the divine alphabet, the circle and the sphere. So if I could get the lights turned out, that would be great. Our first illustration is one that we actually started with on the beginning of the day on Saturday, because it's absolutely fundamental for us. We're starting now from the beginning of the divine alphabet of sacred geometric shapes and forms that create the world and create the functions in the world. And so the form of the circle and the sphere is that primeval form, the primal container of energy and consciousness. So here in William Blake's painting of the Ancient of Days, the Godhead is represented in this initial sphere of creation and then reaching down with the compass to create the movement, to create the next circle or sphere for life to be created within. So what we're going to be seeing in this set of slides is going to be the way that the form of the circle and the sphere manifest in nature at multiple scales to be the primal container of energy and consciousness. And one of the things that makes the fundamental forms of sacred geometry, the primal letters of the divine alphabet, the fundamental letters that they are, is the fact that you can find that exact shape being used in nature at every scale of creation, from the subatomic up to the galactic. If you can't find it from the subatomic all the way up to the manifest realm that we normally experience at our scale, up to the grand scale of the cosmos, then it's not one of the fundamental letters of the divine alphabet. So most of the forms we'll be looking at in the next few days are these fundamental forms. And we've seen that the compass that the Godhead is using is once again connected to our very important concept of you find and establish a fixed center first, and from that fixed center you then make the rotational movement that creates the enclosure, that creates the boundary, that something can be created within, whether it's a world like in the 4 worlds of the Jewish Kabbalah, or whether it is the egg in the mother's womb that the new life will be created within. And so just as the Godhead works in creating these circles and spheres, so we also find that in various initiation systems there will be particular trainings where one learns how to create stabilized energy forms and thought forms. So that, for instance, in the Greek Christian Hermetic school that I mentioned the other day, the work of Daskalos in Cyprus, one of the exercises they would teach you in that school is to create, in the beginning of your healing work with thought forms, to create balls of colored light. And the colored light would correspond to the particular energy quality needed by a person for a particular spiritual or emotional or psychological or physical challenge that they have. In other words, the vibration of it. And that sphere form is the primal form to create as that energetic thought form. Again, it could be created in other forms, but the sphere is the most fundamental. And the illustration here comes from the work of Mantak Chia. Mantak Chia is the gentleman from Thailand who really popularized the Chinese Taoist yoga system in the West. Before the work of Mantak Chia in the 1980s, it was hard to get a lot of the deeper information about various Chinese medical Qigong and esoteric Taoist internal alchemy systems. So he trained with a number of masters, made that information more public than it had been in the past, and today we have an unprecedented release of information about Eastern internal alchemy systems from that beginning. And so it's illustrating that, again, creating this particular sphere, this ball of energy, which can be created either externally from the body or created inside of the body. And there are multiple practices that come from that. So as I said, the primal forms of sacred geometry are found from the subatomic level all the way up to the galactic and are also transcendental. They also occur as spiritual archetypes as well as forms in the physical world. So starting at the very small scale, the atomic scale, molecular scale, we actually find very interesting cutting-edge models today describing things in atomic and nuclear physics and having to do with electromagnetic technology that are using the form of the sphere to illustrate the actual patterns that are there. Now we need to bear in mind that our modern approaches of reductionistic, instrumental, empirical research in modern science is a very new initiative. It's only a couple of 100 years old, really. And in the form it's currently taking, it's really just over 100 years old. So that many of the models that we have in modern science to try to depict particular things that are going on might not yet be complete. So to give you an illustration of this, the way that we normally illustrate the idea of electromagnetic waveforms is as something, as you see in the upper right-hand corner here, of sine waves. And Elizabeth, could I ask you to bring me my pointer from the briefcase in the other room? It's in the very front of the briefcase. Thank you. So if you look at the upper right-hand corner, there is a sine wave, which is the normal way that we represent electromagnetic energies, and has both the positive and negative polarities in different parts of the wave. There is a gentleman named Larry Spring who has written a very interesting book called Common Sense Physics, which is a little bit hard to find, but if you do a search on the internet, you can find it. And I list it in your resource guide from the initial weekend. Thank you. And Larry Spring is an electrical engineer. He's now pretty well advanced in age, but he's still around. He lives in California. And in the book Common Sense Physics, he describes research that he did for decades. And at one time he worked with the group, the International Tesla Society, which at this point no longer exists, but various people from the society are still active. And in this book, Common Sense Physics, he describes his experiments to establish what is the form and the geometric basis of electromagnetic waves. And again, he's someone who really understands electromagnetism. So what he shows is that in particular experiments that he did, particularly in bouncing electromagnetic waves off of various shaped objects, parabolic dishes, things of that kind, he was able to establish that by far the most logical candidate, the one that using Occam's razor of the simplest explanation for the observed phenomena, that would be the actual form of the electromagnetic energies he was working with, is the form of a sphere. So where we normally represent this as a sine wave, he says that sine wave is simply the curled outline of the movement of these electromagnetic spheres. So electromagnetic energy is actually in a spherical form. And when we talk about the different frequencies of electromagnetic energies, 8 gigahertz, 16 gigahertz, etc., that the actual size of the wavelength is related to the actual size of the spheres that you emanate. So 8 gigahertz equals 8 billion cycles per second, and it gives you a wavelength of approximately 1.5 inches. So the movement of these spheres would be around that particular size. And he then goes on to demonstrate that the use of these electromagnetic spheres relates to our things like creating different types of electromagnetic technology. So the type of conductor that we use for the energy, the shape of it will interact with the spherical shape of the electromagnetic energy itself in particular ways. And so he shows that certain forms will keep the sphere from rotating so it will not change polarity. Others will allow it to continue to reverse and to change polarity. So this very interesting model shows that electromagnetic energy, the foundation of our modern science and technology, is in fact based on the form of the sphere itself. Now, a very important concept we discussed the other day having to do with the form of creating the circle or the sphere is that this primal movement that we show with God with the compass of creating the initial point and then creating the rotation of the circle around it is also related to the movement from the center to the periphery, which we might call explosive forces. When you have something explode, it goes from the center and blows up to the periphery. But then there's also implosion. And that's the type of technology we'll talk about tomorrow with the work of Victor Schauberger, where implosion technology does not explode from a center outward, but rather the energies go from the periphery to the center. That's what you get with a form like the vortex that we'll talk about tomorrow. And so we have the movement from center to periphery and periphery to center. And various bodies of work, such as Eurythmy and Rosicrucian science, Rudolf Steiner, etc., they emphasize this movement of etheric life forces from the periphery around us coming into the center, which is also going to be related to some of the explorations that we do with projective geometry, which show this movement from the periphery to the center. But both of these energetic forces, center to periphery, periphery to center, are happening all the time. So another model of things happening at the atomic scale comes from a physicist named Milo Wolf. And this is also in your resource guide. If you take a look at your resource guide, you'll see that it's set up according to the topics that we covered on the weekend, and then according to the topics we'll be covering over the next 5 days. So you look at the section for the circle and the sphere, you'll see the references for Larry Spring and for Milo Wolf. Milo Wolf is a physicist who wrote a very interesting book and has an interesting website that talks about his model from just the observed realities of atomic structures that we know from modern research, that shows that what's actually happening with the proton, with the neutron, and particularly in his work with the electron, is that there is a movement of energy from the center to the periphery and from the periphery to the center. So that things that are happening at the atomic scale can be understood as this constant movement of implosion and explosion pulsing in and out of the center, which is a very interesting model for what stands at the basis of all existence. Because according to modern science, which is a reductionist model, which means to understand something, you don't go to a greater scale to understand wholes, you go to a smaller scale to understand the discrete parts. That in the reductionist model then, to understand something, you got to go to the atom and then to the quarks and then to all the subatomic particles. But of course what happens at that point is things tend to somewhat philosophically fall apart. Because what appears to us to be solid matter, like a solid table, analyzed according to its actual atomic constituents, the atomic constituents of the proton, neutron, electron are comparatively in scale football fields apart. Most of it's empty space. It has to do with vibratory rates that it appears to have a solid nature to it. So that if we look at what is at the essence of this scientific model, if Milo Wolf is right in his idea, that it's all based on the energetics of things moving to the center and moving out to the center. And related to our ideas of biogeometry that we described before, with the importance of the center being a transcendental gateway beyond space and time, that opens up some very interesting ideas. But I just wanted to show you this particular slide from Milo Wolf's work and that idea that what we're actually observing in particle physics, etc., has to do with this constant movement from center to periphery and periphery back to center, what he calls spherical waves. And then one of the great projects today in modern science is how do we unify these different models of science so that we have the basic forces of the world, the weak and strong nuclear force, electricity and magnetism, and gravity, which need to come into some type of unified field theory, and then what's called the grand unified theory. And one interesting body of work today basically shows that it's all connected in a form that is related to the ancient mystical teaching of the serpent swallowing its own tail, and that all these forces are actually connected in a particular type of circuit, then creating this complete circle or enclosure where all the forces feed into one another. Because at the moment, because it's been done in a reductionistic fashion, it's all broken up. Don't see how all the parts relate yet. So when we start looking at it from the subatomic level, we then move up to the level of looking at it as it manifests in the physical world around us at a scale that we can more easily relate to. So one of the clearest images we can have of this is the process of embryogenesis, the process of the egg in the mother's womb becoming fertilized and leading to the new life in the world. And so the egg in the mother's womb is what else? It's the form of a sphere. And the sperm come into the sphere, and the sperm take on more of a linear form. So the line, or the square, then meets the circle, or the sphere, and it creates new life with the interaction between the linear and the circular. So this is something that happens in a literal way, in the way that nature has created these procreative forces. So we start with that form of the egg in the mother's womb becoming fertilized. What then happens is that the genetic components that are being contributed by mother and father then organize themselves into two other circles of genetic material that are known as pronuclei. Now, as a little side note here, these two pronuclei also being formed in these two perfect circles, one beside the other, within the overall egg form of the sphere, The pronuclei each have exactly 23 pairs of chromosomes. And we've already looked at this number 23 in a hidden way yesterday when we talked about the Kabbalistic code of the human subtle bodies. Because we mentioned then that the Kabbalistic code is 3, 7, and 12. 3 mother letters, 7 double letters, 12 elemental letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And those become the coding patterns for the anchor points for the human physical, etheric, and astral bodies. But I mentioned to you that in the Kabbalah they are still blinding one particular aspect of it, which is the final part of the series, which relates to the Holy of Holies, the spiritual core, which is the One. And so if we add those parts together, the 12, the 7, the 3, and the 1, then we come to the number 23. Normally we talk about the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet because the 1 is held out. But if we add the 1 back in for the complete series of 1, 3, 7, 12, that becomes the coding system in the Kabbalah for the creation of the human being and its anchor points, we then find that this is mirrored in the chromosome pairs with 23 pairs of chromosomes. So what we find in all these natural systems are these particular types of harmonic constants, where we can find relationships between the teachings of the great schools, of the archetypes behind things, and then their manifestation in the physical world. Because of course it was only very recently in human history that we knew there were 23 chromosomes. They did not know that in ancient Israel with the Kabbalistic rabbis, but they knew the archetype, and the archetype is what creates all these manifestations. Then of course we come to the point that we have cell division, where the 1 becomes the 2 and the 2 becomes the 4, and this continues to become the 10,000 things. And with that split process, when we first have that movement of the split of the 1 into the 2 with cell division, then we get this very interesting form where the 2 overlap. And we have one circle overlapping the other circle, creating this almond-shaped form between them called the Vesica. And we'll be dealing with the Vesica more later today, both in my talks and in the work that you do with drafting with Jane. And then of course it goes from this overlapping with the Vesica to becoming the 2 become 4, etc. And it gives you the 4 nodal points of a tetrahedron inside the replicating cell, and it continues on an outward process from there. And during this particular process, as the cells begin to form and they begin to organize into the living being, and this is always a sticky wicket for materialistic scientists because they have to explain why the second law of thermodynamics is the law of entropy, where energetic systems lose energy and become more disorganized, but somehow, magically, things self-organize. They don't explain how it happens, but somehow it self-organizes, and it has this perfect geometry to it, and it becomes a living being. So they self-organize, and they have particular patterns of energy that then form as the cells replicate. It becomes a backbone, it becomes a matrix, and then particular energy circuits appear in it. If you study Chinese medical Qigong text, they can be very specific about the process in the evolution of the egg within the womb and creating the fetus, where the different acupuncture channels develop at different time periods. And one of the primal energy circuits is the central energy channel in the body, what is referred to as the thrusting channel in Taoist yoga, for example. And that is also then connected to the opening at the top of the head. But the central energy with the spine and the energy that runs in this vertical circuit will then be connected to the energy that we find in a human being as that energy of the thrusting channel or the Sushumna channel of energy in the body, which connects us in energy straight down to the earth and straight up to the heavens. And this vertical column is one of the most important columns of geometric energy in the body to use for initiation purposes. And we'll do a little bit more with it as the course goes on. And of course, as this process continues and the full fetus is formed, then we come to the point that the infant is formed, and once again, although now it has differentiated, its original form was the pure geometry of the cell, just like the pure form of the virus is an icosahedron. But as beings become more complex, they lose the simple, pure form of the geometry and take on a more differentiated form. But nonetheless, as the form of the human being differentiates and becomes the form that we recognize as a human being, it is once again held within the form of the egg, or the spherical form, in this case the amniotic sac. So once again, as we are infants, fetuses in the womb, we are once again held within the sphere as we move toward birth. Again, this illustrates the concept that the sphere is nature's primal container of energy and consciousness. So along these lines, this illustrates ideas for why the scarab beetle was used in the Egyptian mysteries to illustrate certain cosmic processes. Because one aspect of the scarab beetle that people living in Egypt would observe is that the scarab beetle rolls a ball of dung, creating a sphere, and lays its eggs inside of it. So what they would observe is that this beetle creates a sphere and rolls it, the way the Godhead creates spheres and manifests it. And then from that sphere of dung, new life would emerge. And so again, it became a perfect representation in nature of the process of creating spheres and life emerging from it. And then when you see the scarab beetle illustrated in the Egyptian iconography, they would associate with it this particular process. So we also have a particular process that I have some comments about later in your handout that you got today. That's more for the stuff later in the week when we deal with this. But in one part of Rudolf Steiner's work, he describes the way that certain cosmic forces ray in and they create different geometries in human bodies and the bodies of other living beings. And one of those processes is to create these hollowed out pockets or invagination in the body, and then in many cases to create a form that will fit in the pocket. So for instance, in the head, there are forces that come and hollow out the place that we have as the eye sockets. And then other forces come in to create the form of the sphere of the eyes that will fit within the pocket. And so the eye itself is the form of a sphere, the form that we actually use to perceive the world around us. Nature has given the form of a sphere, and it is the organ of vision. I threw this picture in because I've always really liked it. There's a great book that I think has been out of print for a long time. The version I have is from the 70s. It was called Behold Man. And it's, again, listed in your resource guide. Behold Man is a series of medical photographs taken by, I believe they're Scandinavian researchers, when they first began to create these fiber optic camera links, where they get very tiny fiber optic cameras and put it into parts of the human body you couldn't get into before, into a living body, and take photographs of it. So they got a fiber optic camera in behind a living person's eyeball. So it's behind their eyeball looking out. So what you see the person is looking at, this is the upside down image of their daughter talking on the telephone. Because the image is actually inverted within the eye itself. So now they're actually able to take the actual picture of what it would be like if you could be behind a person's eyeball and see the image in the sphere itself.
Then does the brain flip it?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
So following these same principles, as we move from the subatomic to the scale that we normally interact with in the world, then up to great levels of creation, we find many models connected to the circle and the sphere. We talked about the four worlds of the Kabbalah before. This is a classic Indian model of the cosmic human being creating the cosmos and all the constellations and things within it, where the feet move back up to the head and create this circular movement. And there are many models of this kind with different traditions. Now this is a very interesting bit of information from a body of work by a man named Itzhak Bentov. And some of you might be familiar with Bentov's work. Itzhak Bentov was a great scientist and researcher who died, I believe, in the late 70s in a tragic plane crash. And Bentov wrote a couple of books which are in your resource guide, which I highly recommend. One is called A Brief Tour of Higher Consciousness, which used to have a different title, which is I have a hard time remembering it. It used to be called A Cosmic Book, but somehow they didn't like that title. They changed it to A Brief Tour of Higher Consciousness, and that's where this illustration comes from. He also has another very good book on the mechanics of creation called Stalking the Wild Pendulum, which only has a little bit to do with pendulum. It's not really about dowsing. It's about particular processes of mechanics of creation. But in this book, A Brief Tour of Higher Consciousness, which I highly recommend, he's basically giving out particular spiritual visions that he has had over time. Now, there's an interesting story about Itzhak Bentov, which is that as he was working with his spiritual scientific work and developing his spiritual visions, he got to the point that he needed to test out what he had found. And I found by talking to someone who knew him that he had a particular spiritual master that he consulted. And what I thought was very amusing is that his spiritual master was an Irish cop in New York City who was very highly spiritually developed, but no one on the force knew what the guy really was. But I love that idea of your spiritual master being an Irish cop in New York City. So in this book, A Brief Tour of Higher Consciousness, he gives these remarkable geometric images of what he's seen about the structures of higher realms, because he's using a process taught in the Himalayan tradition where you move your awareness up to greater and greater scales of consciousness. The same thing was done by the Theosophist in the opposite direction of moving attention down to smaller and smaller scales to observe the geometries of atomic particles, the work of Besant and Leadbeater. But in this Indian work, one would also move one's awareness out to greater and greater scales until your awareness is not just your body, but of the city, of the entire planet Earth, of the entire solar system, of the galaxy, of the universe, and beyond. It's a classical practice in the Indian tradition. And so in doing this practice over years, and Bentov was a very evolved soul, he saw a particular image as he moved out past the sphere of creation that we are a part of here. And he says what he saw was this void of pure consciousness surrounding this sphere. And as he examined the form of the sphere that contained everything in our world, what we think of as our universe of creation, then he began to see that there were forms on the outside of the sphere that were rotating. And they appeared to him to be like rotating disks. And then as he moved his awareness back down to the surface, to these rotating disks, and then examined their structure, he saw that what appeared to be rotating disks were actually forms that are the same thing that you see at the top of the Sanskrit letters, and that beneath it there were these other forms, and that essentially what they were are the same geometric forms one finds in the Sanskrit alphabet, that the Sanskrit letters are actually these three-dimensional geometric forms on the surface of the sphere of creation that are rotating. And the rotation, the movement of these forms on the surface is then bringing this void of pure consciousness into movement and into a sound, which is the sound of the seed syllables talked about in the Indian tradition. And that then creates the forces of the manifest world beneath it. So that the Sanskrit alphabet, as a holy alphabet, are the actual geometric forms on the surface of the sphere of creation, which I thought is a very beautiful image to have of why is this a sacred alphabet and what do the forms relate to. So we also have the idea of the spheres, of course, on the tree of life. This is probably the most fundamental geometric glyph of life forms in the Western tradition, coming, of course, from the Jewish Kabbalah, but according to some Greeks, actually having its origin in the school of Akhenaten in Egypt. So different theories regarding it. But again, what we find with it is that we have 10 spheres connected on 22 paths. And as we spoke about before, the 22 paths divide up into our classic 3, 7, 12 divisions of 3 horizontal lines, 7 vertical lines, and 12 diagonal lines. And that this form is understood as being superimposed over the human energy body. So sometimes we hear stories from the Eastern tradition about great Maha avatars, such as Babaji, that have the capacity to actually manifest from the ethers a physical body and incarnate at will at any time. From the perspective of some of these Kabbalistic schools, both Jewish and Greek and Rosicrucian and various hidden schools throughout Europe, one of the great secrets of these schools is that one of the forms that can be used to manifest a physical form, a body, whether in this world or in higher worlds, is by manifesting the form of the tree of life. It becomes the energetic blueprint that the body then forms around. And every one of the spheres has a particular activity or function that's interconnected in the net or the matrix of the lines connecting the sephira. For most schools, they will not talk about this publicly. They consider it to be one of the highest secrets of their form of work as they develop the tree of life in the field and then do higher esoteric work with it. But I can assure you that for many of these schools, that's exactly the way that they consider this form. There's a very interesting text, also referenced in your resource guide, that's called The Kabbalah, the Mystical Heritage of the Children of Abraham. there's a lot of books about the Kabbalah out. To be honest, just like with Feng Shui, most of them say the same thing. But as in Feng Shui, there are also particular texts that really give some remarkable information you don't see elsewhere. And so for the Kabbalah, this particular text on the mystical heritage of the children of Abraham comes from a particular group based in California called the Work of the Chariot Trust. And without going into all the details about this group, this book was the first time that their work had been made public. And in this book, they talk about particular aspects of the Tree of Life and its use for initiation work that, again, is hard to find in other material. So one of the aspects of it is that there's a way of working with the sequence of the spheres in the Tree of Life for initiation, and that according to the direction that you go in connecting those spheres energetically and activating them in a circuit, it will lead to different results in spiritual evolution. Again, there's some real deep waters here. I'll just give you the upshot of it, which is they call one way the way of the wizard and the other the way of the saint. The basic idea being that according to what is called the lightning flash pattern of connection, one is moving from here to here, the other starts from here to here. It's also related to the concept of a left-hand path versus a right-hand path. And again, without going into all the esotericism of it, one of the ideas there is that according to the way that we develop ourselves, we can end up with one of two types of development. One, the way of the wizard, is that one becomes a type of occultist that has access to powers, but does not develop necessarily a deeper level of wisdom in the process. And the other one is the way of the saint, where the powers come later as a result of the wisdom that is gained, rather than being pursued on their own. And this is something that you actually find described in many different traditions, including in the Indian tradition, where they talk about we don't try to achieve the siddhas, the powers, in and of themselves. They will come naturally of the growth of our wisdom and our consciousness. I wanted to throw this in because there are particular relationships at the archetypal level between geometric forms that illustrate particular hidden phenomena. And so one of those has to do with looking at the volume between a cube and a sphere. When you have a cube that completely covers up the sphere, and you look at the volume of each of them, then they have a particular very interesting relationship to them. And that is that the relationship of one to the other, if you give the sphere the value of 10, then the volume value of the cube is 19 and change. So I found this very interesting because most of the particular phenomena that I have found taught by different teachers and traditions having to do with the power of particular forms or particular numbers are usually related to one particular archetypal form, an archetype in the thought forms in the mind of God. And so we've talked in the biogeometry course about the power of the number 19 and about the way that 19 is this tremendously holy number in the Islamic tradition that is really emphasized in Islam in a way you don't really find in other traditions. And so one aspect of that number 19 has to do with the relationship between the sphere and the cube, which we could also think of as being related to the relationship between the circle and the square. So that the cube, with the materialization force completely surrounding the divine sphere of creation that's inside of it, has this relationship to the number 19. So that might be a clue to us of how come we get the effect that we get in biogeometry when we use the number 19, 19 of a particular thing in an identifiable grouping, and we get this BG3 energy quality we described before. This could be one of the geometric resonance aspects to it in a higher world that gives it that energy quality here in this world. Now, when we deal with the concept of the circle or the sphere, classical models constantly show us the act of creation as circles within circles or as spheres within spheres. And so here's one from the Rosicrucian tradition with the Holy Divine Sophia and the world, and it's made up of spheres within spheres connected to the spheres of the planets and to the elements, things of that kind, and then with the divine spiritual beings and forces on the outer spheres. But you will find versions of this in multiple traditions, in Buddhism, Hinduism, etc. And interestingly enough, one of the most common models of the human energy field is based on this, where we have a form of the spheres within our physical body, and then with the etheric, emotional, mental, etc., and higher bodies as these concentric envelopes around the physical body. So again, these envelopes are modified from a purely spherical form to match the outline of the human being. But nonetheless, it's the same concept of spheres within spheres, and the boundary layers between them actually become the boundary layers of the auric sheath for the different higher bodies. Interestingly enough, if you study the work of Plato, where he's describing the teachings from the Egyptian mystery school given to the Greek Solon, it talks about the actual city of Atlantis as being this form of circles within circles, that there are these concentric circles of water and then land, water and then land, water and then land. And in the very center was the great solar temple of Atlantis. And so if we think of why is it represented that way, either it actually was that way based on a model of the circles within circles, spheres within spheres, or it's been brought into their teaching to help illustrate that concept. Now, another way that we can see this idea of the circles within circles is in the classical form of a labyrinth, which is basically the form of a circle within a form that you can walk it and move through the circuit. And there are many different energetic aspects to the labyrinth, most of which could be analyzed using concepts from biogeometry that make it effective. And of course, classically, we think of the labyrinth in terms of things like the classical seven-circuit labyrinth, the ones in Crete, and with the larger labyrinth form that we find in places like Chartres Cathedral in France. But interestingly enough, if we take a look at the actual, what's known as the seed pattern of these circles within circles or spheres within spheres, one way that you can actually construct it is by starting with a seed pattern that is based on the form of a cross. And of course, the cross is also related to our form of the square. So here we have the square and the circle again. So with the cross, and then with these right angles, and then a point here, it's just a matter of connecting up the points. And at that point, you get the complete outline for the labyrinth you're going to construct. So this is known as the seed pattern for the classical seven-circuit labyrinth. And then you could create more involved seed patterns to get a labyrinth with higher numbers of circuits. For a seven-circuit labyrinth, it's the basic cross with the right angles. Then you add in more of the right angles and points for an 11, 15, or 19-circuit labyrinth. There's also the form known as the meander pattern, which is like two counter-rotating spirals. And that can then be elaborated also to create the form of a labyrinth. So I want to give you the sense that for some of these forms, there are deeper relationships to other seed patterns that they can grow out of, and that are classically used to help construct these patterns. For the Chartres Cathedral, it's an 11-circuit round form, and this shows you the actual seed pattern for it. Because what we do is we move from a symmetrical pattern, or the purely form of the cross here, to where now we move one arm of the cross up, and we begin to stagger it a bit. And then we develop it further and further, as we see here with the 11th circuit. So it's based on the same idea, but now it's getting more evolved, it's getting more elaborate. And we're starting to shift the points a bit, but it still gives us the seed pattern for the form of the Chartres type of labyrinth. Also, if we take a look at the Indian tradition, we find that, of course, they use the form of the circle, the sphere, etc., with their healing patterns, with their diagrams, with their sigils of various types that are used for spiritual or for medicinal purposes. This is from a wonderful text called Yantra that I highly recommend for those interested in the Indian work with this type of material. And again, it's in your resource guide. It says, this is an occult yantra believed to cure diseases when worshipped ceremonially for 45 days. Now this one here, I found very interesting. It's also depicted in this text. It said that this is a particular diagram classically used in India, given to women to ease the pain and difficulties in childbirth. That by them meditating on this pattern, which is very similar to a labyrinth pattern, that it really helped them in the process of childbirth itself.
It also looks a lot like the evening thing.
Yes. So with this understanding of the circles within circles and spheres within spheres, we can see that when we take the form of the circle within the circle, if we were to elaborate that out, that those circles within circles would actually become these guidelines of circles staggered at different heights that then, when connected up, would become the form of a sphere. So basically it's a matter of these circles within circles, when they're solved topologically to become a three-dimensional form, then they give us the form of the sphere itself. So one is a two-dimensional projection of the other, in other words. This is from an interesting book by Bruce Rawls, where the whole book is like this. He calls it the Sacred Geometry Design Source Book. It also is a little hard to find, but you can find it on the internet. And it shows 144 overlapping circles with a common edge point. So all this is one circle after the next, slightly staggered, and all of them meeting at the center here. And so when you see these types of designs, which have a kind of a flashing effect, and are very energetically powerful, they're often made by this pure circular movement of one circle after the other within a circular diagram, all meeting at a central point. This is a pattern of the ancient Temple of Minerva. So this temple for the divine feminine in Greece, as you saw earlier today in working with the construct of the Parthenon, that so many vital concepts went into it. And with the gematria, the linkage between the numbers related to the names, with the idea of the Kabbalistic name or the Kabbalistic word being a type of formula, a energy template of the sounds that make up the nature of the being itself, that those names and numbers, when they were put together in the form of the Parthenon, created a beautiful, harmonious structure with the superimposition of one on the next in a complete form. And so the building itself has to have within its design the particular bases that will resonate with the being that the temple is being made for. Because classically in the ancient world, if you built a sacred site, a temple, it was meant to be the living space, in a sense the actual body for a higher being, which is one reason why we saw that in ancient Egypt they would design temples based on the template of a human body and its energy functions, and find the same thing in India and other cultures, because the temple is meant to be the actual body for the higher being. That's also one reason why we then, as we described yesterday, tie in the actual structure itself to the earth energy grid, because the building, as it's becoming a kind of physical body for the higher spiritual being to move within and to live within, has to have this vital energy within it, just like a living body has vital energy. And so we connect it to the earth's own vital energy, the same way that our energy body is connected to the earth. Now, you might be aware of the fact that in the space program, they found that for people to stay healthy in space, they had to provide a particular energy resonance within their living environments that's known as the Schumann resonance. It's around 7.82 hertz. And this is actually a background frequency of the Earth itself. And it's also connected to a core brain frequency in the human being. So we have a particular type of vibrational energetic environment linked to the Earth that they're now finding need to be taken with the astronauts into space to make them feel grounded. And so in creating the temple, there are all these different aspects to making it in the correct form that the being it's intended for can live within it. So here for this divine feminine netter of Minerva, we have this purely circular form with the forms around it being circles on the perimeter, and then the opening in the center being itself this semicircular form that can be entered into the center. We find something similar in other traditions around the world, such as the Native Americans in the Southwest Desert with some of the large kiva-type structures that are actually built into the earth. And so these are very, very large, purely circular in nature, and they're creating a similar type of energy effect. And so in connecting this to the form of the circle and the sphere, we can also remember that in biogeometry, we talked about the way that a circular movement or a spherical movement has a center that then has a BG3 type of effect. And so you find many traditions using the circular form for a sacred space. And the Knights Templar would use either the form of a circle for their a round building for their temple, or the Knights Templar would use the form of an octagon, which is the same as you find for the Dome of the Rock and many other temples, because the octagon has the principle that we describe in biogeometry as virtual rotation. Although it's a stable structure, it energetically acts as if it's rotating, and it creates a BG3 emanation from its center. So then we come to the idea of the propagation of energy on the sphere itself. In the work done by the French researchers that we described the other day, when their energy research having to do with shapes and forms, where they discovered the existence of what we called shape-caused waves, they found that the energy on the surface of a sphere, whether it was a sphere you held in your hands or whether it was the sphere of the Earth itself, constantly moved. The different energy qualities would move in a regular pattern over the surface of the sphere according to the position of the sun. And this is a very interesting concept. When you have a three-dimensional object or a three-dimensional sphere, to have the placement of the energy qualities on its surface, that is determined by what is the primary energy determinator for that local system. And for the three-dimensional object, and we look into three-dimensional space, what is the primary energy determinator for the Earth as a local system? And it is the sun. The sun is by far the most powerful energy source for our local system. And so they found that it was the sun's position vis-a-vis the Earth itself that led to the shifting and activation of the energies on different locations as they moved one to the other. We're also going to see this principle coming out at the end of the week when we deal with concepts of the Earth grid, and particularly the work of Bruce Cathy from Australia, where he found that the sun's position vis-a-vis the Earth would activate at particular times and places parts of the Earth grid. What we just described with the primary determinator of the sun creating energy effects on the three-dimensional form of the sphere in the French research is true for the three-dimensional object. But for a two-dimensional object, when you move it down dimensionally from 3 dimensions to 2 dimensions and it becomes a flat object, they found that for that, the thing that determined the placement of the energies was actually the Earth's north-south magnetic lines. Now this is the same concept that the feng shui specialists in ancient China discovered when they developed their compass school, where they would set up the Bagua of the 8 basic energy qualities of the 8 basic trigrams of the I Ching on the Bagua according to the energy determinator of the Earth's north-south magnetic line. And they knew that the energies propagated from there. So the Earth's magnetics are also involved in this process for the form of a circle. So for a sphere, connection to the sun. For the circle, connection to the Earth's own magnetic lines. Is that if they simply cut the sphere in half and made the form of a hemisphere or a dome, that then they would get this emission of that energy of the carrier wave out of the base of it. And they also discovered that the form of the pyramid was essentially energetically identical, that from the base of the pyramid you got an emanation of that same energy quality. And this explains why in the ancient world they used the form of the pyramid as a place of initiation to access that energy quality, that spiritual carrier wave, which sends energy and information from one place to another place, whether it's done from one place to another place on the physical Earth or between higher worlds and the Earth itself. They used the pyramid as the place of initiation. And then as the Greeks and Romans began to master the use of the copula and the dome shape, then it became more common to see the use of the dome being put over the place of worship rather than the pyramid. And so you then find that the mosque, the synagogue, the cathedral, etc., in the West will then commonly have the dome over the top to give you that emanation of that energy quality. So the half sphere is what comes into it. And just to connect it to the idea we mentioned yesterday, when we analyze the energetics of that pyramid or that half sphere form of the dome, what we then find is that not only does it emanate from its base the spiritual carrier wave, which the French called negative green, but that also what we're talking about with these different energy bands that they discovered, and they identified 12 different energy bands, which once again were transcendental. You find those same energy bands in all quality scales, whether they are sound scales or color scales or the scales of shape, etc. These are the energy qualities that make up everything in the world. They found that these were simply simplified bands by cutting the whole spectrum into 12 different bands. And within each band, there were multiple sub-bands. And to be honest, because much of the French research was really cut dead by World War II and the German invasion and the chaos of World War II, and was never fully picked up again. A lot of identification of these energetics and these sub-bands has never been continued. And so one thing we're hoping from with teaching people about this, and particularly teaching the biogeometry course, is that people will get the basic concepts and skills to start identifying more of the sub-bands and their particular functions. Because this individual, known as Anel, whose real name was Kerner Skariatin, wrote in the 1950s about his discovery that within that band of what's called negative green, or the spiritual carrier wave that the French identified, was a particular sweet spot, a sub-band within it, that he called the pi wave or the omega wave, about 6 degrees 15 minutes off of center. And that explained why, because he lived in Egypt, he found that that was the position of the sarcophagus in the king's chamber, that they specifically positioned the sarcophagus in the internal location of the pyramid to get the correct energetic ray that was the sweet spot, the optimal carrier wave function within that overall band. So again, it's not only the overall shape we're working with, but particular sub-locations within the shape have particular energy qualities. Basic harmonics working with the form of the circle and the sphere are related to 6, in a sense 7, and 12. And by that I mean what you've already found, which is if you get, let's say, 7 pennies, and you put 1 penny in the center as a circle, you'll find that you can perfectly nest 6 equally sized pennies around it, with no space in between. This is a perfect form. Same thing as if you're working with a compass, with the same radius for all of the circles that you draw. And that then gives you this hexagonal enclosure form as we see here. And this can continue outward after you have the 6 around the 1, which gives you the basic 7 days of creation. Then you can add more and more layers, and it just keeps going out and out from there. The next layer, you get another 6, so now you've got 12 around the 1. Then you get another 6, and if you add in the center point, then you have 19 total. And then you add more and more on the outside. So this is a basic construction pattern working with the circles. Of course, it's also true if we were to use it working with spheres. I can perfectly get 6 spheres around a central sphere of an equal size. But then if I want to completely cover the sphere, the way we talked about the other day with the harmonic of 12, 12 is the foundation in the Kabbalistic coding system of the physical body, I can find that I can perfectly get 3 spheres on top above the central sphere and 3 at the bottom. 6 around, 3 at top, 3 at the bottom. It gives me perfectly 12 spheres around the 1, which we described yesterday as being related to the 12 perspectives around a central subject that allows you to understand it fully. 12 disciples around Christ, 12 arhats of Buddha, etc. Now, if I was to then connect up the center of all those 12 different spheres, then what I would get is this form that's known as the cube octahedron, and that Buckminster Fuller named the vector equilibrium, because every one of the nodal points of it are exactly the same length from the center. They're all exactly the same length from center, creating this form. And it's called a cube octahedron because it has the same number of square faces as a cube and the same number of triangular faces as an octahedron. So we're going to be dealing with that later on with Platonic solids and Archimedean solids. But for right now, I want you to understand the 12 spheres around the 1. Because we're working with this primal form of creation, the form of the circle and the sphere. It's our first letter of the divine alphabet. So we've seen some of the ways that it manifests. And what we want to take a look at now is the very important form that we get when we begin to overlap one circle or sphere with another, and they create a perfect portal between the two of them, known as the Vesica Piscis. Do we know if lunch is ready, or if they're not here yet? Oh, they are ready? Okay, so they are downstairs waiting for us? Okay. Well, they asked us to please stop at 12:30, and it's now 12:30. So we'll pick this up this afternoon, working with the Vesica, and you'll also be doing drafting with Jane, where you'll use this form to create the classical, very important patterns of classical sacred geometry used by the masters of the compass. So in your work today with Jane, you explored the creation of the Vesica. Let's take a look at some of the core principles involved here. Let's remember what we looked at this morning with the creation of life through the sphere. That the sphere was the egg in the mother's womb, and when it became fertilized, it split in two. And we showed you that that split in two then created a Vesica pattern. So one way to think of this Vesica pattern is that when you have that split of the unity, the one, into the two, the first movement into polarity and into creation, that the place that we're looking at the Vesica is the center of the Vesica that's actually the place of the original sphere. So if you're looking for the center of this form, it's in the center of the Vesica. And in fact, when you draft the Vesica, you can easily create a straight line down the center of the Vesica and one that connects the two centers of the circles, creating a cross in the center of the Vesica. And it's the center of that cross that would be the center of the original circle before the split into polarity. That's one thing to bear into mind. The next thing to bear into mind is that when you actually did the drafting of the Vesica itself, you put the point of your compass down here, and then with the lead of your compass you drew the perimeter of the first circle. Then you moved to the perimeter of that first circle and made that the center of drawing your second circle. And this gave you two circles perfectly harmonically overlapped, which gave you then that the outer boundary, the periphery of one circle, perfectly touches the center of the other. So it's a perfect balance between center and periphery for both circles. And then in their overlapping, they create the form of the Vesica, which is a perfectly balanced portal, in a sense, for unity between polarity. And it's often looked as a portal between the worlds. And so you will see in different traditions Buddha coming through that portal, or Mary, or Christ, basically beings that hold a balance between two complementary polarities. And so the Vesica has to do with that whole principle of unity moving into polarity and the act of creation. And we have the form of the Vesica represented in many different sacred contexts. One of the best known is on the lid of Chalice Well at Glastonbury, a famous Grail site in Britain. So in working with these two polarities that are coming together, the basic idea is that the balance between the two polarities comes from particular spiritual forces that can balance the polarities of the manifest world. And we see this pattern of the Vesica in a number of different contexts used as a grid or a matrix. For instance, in Britain, there have been studies done of the stone circles in Britain. And they found that many of these stone circles, which do not have a perfect circular form, that the actual form that is behind them in the creation of the circles in the first place, when these things were analyzed in books like Keith Critchlow's Time Stands Still, and in other work done in Britain, they have found that the background grid behind it is based on the form of the Vesica. And then through particular methods, they created the overall shape of the stone circle. And this also becomes a grid or a matrix for various types of art. So here, in the Bible of Charles the Bald, the king and his court, the background matrix behind the construction of this piece of art is this Vesica form. And the same thing for the famous Diet of Mantua painting. It has to do with these overlapping forms creating multiple forms of the Vesica in the way that it's actually laid out. And even the form of the arch at the top is part of one of the circles creating the Vesica. So in understanding various types of sacred art and sacred architecture, understanding these core patterns of creation is vital to know where the patterns came from. So for instance, in many of the cathedrals of Europe, you will very often see a matrix that is based on the form of a Vesica, as you have here. And so what is actually a very common form in cathedrals in Europe is that you have these forms of the Vesica, one inside of the other. And the basic matrix that the Masons used to draft it was a full form of a Vesica, but they only used the top part of it. And then the bottom part, which has to be based on the earth and with the opening into the structure, then has a more rectangular form. But the original matrix behind it, which then comes down to the point at the base of the door at the top of the steps is that place of the completed Vesica. So it's still there energetically, even though all that's represented physically is the top part of the Vesica. And these are often represented as a kind of a fractal form of one Vesica inside another. You can stay here. And so sometimes you don't see the entire form of the Vesica the way that I just showed you, even to the extent of the last illustration, but just a partial form such as this, where here even less of the Vesica is presented. But once again, it's a fractal form of one Vesica form inside another, inside another, inside another. For those of you that took the biogeometry training, you might remember that we said at that time that one way to correct the form of an arch, because the arch has a particular form connected to the form of a dome, and so it has both aspects, both the beneficial and detrimental energy aspects of the spiritual carrier wave, also known as negative green. And so one way that that is classically balanced is by making a particular mark at the top. So on a dome, this is a spire or a spike on the top of the dome. In the form of an arch in sacred architecture, it can become a line at the very top of the arch. So that in Islamic architecture, what this would become is a kind of a spiked top to a doorway. But in the form that you see in Western Europe, it's like this. It's using the Vesica to create a point toward the top of the arc. And then by having multiple forms, one inside of the other, not only does that create a specific type of energetic, having these forms nested one inside of the other, but you could also then bring in other principles, such as the principle of the quality of number, according to the number of these forms that are one inside of the other. As we've mentioned before, having a specific number of repetitions of a pattern will create specific energetics, such as the quality of the number 7 can give you the quality of the spiritual carrier wave. 16 or 19 can give you the BG3. So here, what we see is that within this form of the Vesica, it's very common to see in European cathedrals that not only do you have the external form of part of the Vesica in this arch above the doorway, but then you have the complete form of the Vesica inside those multiple Vesica partial forms. So here's a complete form of the Vesica with Christ inside of it. In Western Europe, you'll often also see this with the Virgin Mary inside of it. And you notice that around it, you then have the 4 heavenly creatures that we talked about before, which are related to the 4 anchor points of the great cross in the heavens, with the zodiacal signs of Scorpio and Taurus and Leo and Aquarius shown around the Christ coming through the Vesica. Yes?
What does the spike represent?
The spike is actually an energy correction form. If you simply test the quality of the energy from a pure dome or a pure arch, this is also true for architectural vaults, that it has both types of the spiritual carrier wave, or the technical name is negative green from the French. And by making this correction, it gets rid of the detrimental energy component and amplifies the beneficial aspect when you actually directly energetically test it. And this is similar to what we do in the biogeometry course, where we have you build a pyramid form and then make that correction that is equal to the 1/2 degree indentation in the center of all 4 faces on the pyramids at Giza Plateau. It changes the energy quality. So when we take a look at the iconography related to the Vesica, once again we start off with the overlapping of the 2 circles. And classically in Western Europe, in the Christian ages, we then see the Christ within the Vesica, as you will sometimes see Buddha or other beings inside the Vesica in the East. So what we see here is that that form of the Christ inside the Vesica is also related to a particular construction that was known to the sacred geometers, the masters of the net, the masters of the compass, in which you have a particular form of a root rectangle that you all have been working with, that inside of it you get the form of a Vesica. And according to a particular division of it, you then are given a particular anchor point for the eye of the fish. And so one aspect of the fish symbol of Christianity is that the fish symbol is the Vesica itself. And the eye in the fish is related to a particular part of geometric construction of the root rectangles. You also find the use of the Vesica as a matrix for various cathedrals, things of that kind, particularly in Britain. You will see cathedrals laid out according to patterns like this. So within that overall form of the Vesica, they don't make it in the rounded form of the Vesica, rather they make the cathedral based on the form of the lines connecting the two side anchor points and the top and the bottom. So it becomes more of a rhombic diamond type of form. Now there's another aspect of this rhombic diamond we're going to talk about later in the course when we get into higher dimensions, because these rhombic diamond forms are a form that you get when a lower dimensional form is under dimensional stress. And I'll clarify that for you later, but just bear that in mind. And so we see that there's a variety of different forms related to the Vesica that come about in the sacred architecture. There's a deeper spiritual teaching associated with this that has to do with the thought forms in the mind of God. And that is that when things manifest into our world, they can either have a perfectly balanced nature between spirit and matter, or they can tend toward the side of spirit and away from matter, or they can tend toward the side of matter and away from spirit. Now what this basically means for us is that this is also true for spiritual beings. There are certain spiritual beings that hold a perfect balance between spirit and matter, an understanding of spiritual processes and the necessities and purposes of earthly physical incarnation and earthly life. These are the beings that in the Western tradition are referred to as Michaelic beings, following the Archangel Michael. It's interesting if you actually study the sacred documents of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, the spiritual being who is referred to the most in the documents of the three monotheistic traditions is the Archangel Michael. He is the angelic being who is most commonly referenced. And so one of the things that stands behind that is that Michael represents that perfect balance point, that Vesica, that center of perfect connection between spirit and matter. Both are perfectly balanced together. And those are the two circles. So the two circles of the Vesica would be that one then represents spirit and one represents matter. And it's where the two perfectly overlap in the Vesica that you have a perfect balancing of spirit and matter. And so the being that is coming through the Vesica, Christ, Mary, Buddha, etc., is a being connected to the perfect balance of spirit and matter. This is represented by Rudolf Steiner in one of his sculptural pieces that's known as the representative of humanity. The basic idea in Rosicrucianism is that the Christ being is the literal representative of humanity, that the nature of the Christ being and the spiritual essence of the Christ being is the same as that for the human being. And so that all the stories in the New Testament of the life of Christ are actually a type of mystery drama, a depiction of every stage that a human being needs to go through in the process of human evolution. And before reaching that stage of ascension, you actually have the stage of crucifixion in matter and the descent into hell that then leads to a resurrection and the ascension as occurs in the Christ story. This is why in classical forms of medieval Christian initiation, there would be a particular stage after stage of spiritual development related to the 7 stages of the Passion of Christ, because they are representing a particular story of human evolution. And this is sometimes represented as Christ holding the balance between two opposing spiritual beings. And the two opposing spiritual beings that Christ holds a balance between are those spiritual beings on the one side that represent unbalanced spirituality. In other words, spiritual beings that are very connected to spirit, but they don't really have an understanding of matter in the physical world. They have different names and different traditions, but in the classical medieval Christian tradition, they are referred to as Luciferic beings. Lucifer means light bringer. And so these are beings that have spiritual wisdom and spiritual light. These are not the same as satanic beings, although in later Christian history, the difference between Luciferic and satanic beings was completely lost, and they were just treated as one type of being. At that point, it was impossible to be able to accurately identify opposing spiritual beings that one encountered in direct spiritual activity, because that differentiation was lost between their two natures. Particular groups in esoteric Christianity still maintain a knowledge of the two different types of spiritual beings, and they are referenced in earlier works. And you can still find references by groups like the Jesuits today that say, oh yes, these are indeed two different beings, although they don't go to much trouble to make that clear to the public. It's simpler just to say, these are the bad guys, these are the good guys, and don't go with the bad guys. Part of that is that you can then create a simple polarity, but understanding a simple polarity will lead you off track spiritually, because things are not always simply good and bad in a polarity system. Is positive poles of a electrical system good and negative bad, or the same for magnetic systems? How about for polarity in genders? Who is good between men and women? It is not a question in polarity systems of one necessarily being good and one being bad. Rather, it is a question that opposed polarities need a balance in the center, which is why you get the medieval representation of the divine hermaphrodite, and they will show you a picture of a human being that is half female and half male. And so this teaching within the Vesica is of that perfect balance between the spiritual and the material, and between the two polarities, however they manifest in the world. We have to balance many different polarities in our life: breathing in, breathing out, hot and cold, light and dark, male and female. And so that position of balance is represented geometrically by the Vesica. This also means that one of the thought forms in the mind of God that one can access through meditation is the form of the Vesica as the blueprint for the creation of those spiritual beings that are spiritual beings of light but do not understand the materialization process or why that is necessary. On the one side, with the one sphere, and with the other sphere, those spiritual beings that tend to drag humanity down to a lower level. These are the beings that were referred to as Ahrimanic in the old Persian Zoroastrian system. They then were referred to as Set in the Egyptian system. They then were referred to as Ha-Setan in the Hebrew system, which later became Satan, and also related to the principle of the beast in the book of Revelation. It's the same group of spiritual beings which, although they are spiritual in nature, they are actually part of the divine process through which the archetypes in the mind of God materialize into the physical plane. And you find references to these beings all through the various traditions, particularly in the West. And so that these beings related to the materialization process can actually lead human beings away from believing that they are spiritual in nature to begin with. And on the earth in the last couple of 100 years, this process has reached a culmination point to where modern science, etc., does not accept any metaphysical concepts or any concept of the human being as being spiritual in nature. We are a biological accident. We came about through some random pairings of nucleotides and proteins, and when we die, that's it, you're gone. There is no spirit, it's purely physical. So that there's an understanding, once again, of those beings that hold a balance between these two types of beings. In esoteric Rosicrucianism, they use the terms Luciferic for those beings that tend toward spirit and do not understand matter, and Ahrimanic for those who tend toward matter and draw human beings away from spirit. There's very, very deep esoteric teachings in multiple traditions for thousands of years related to the nature of these beings, and the nature of the two groups are very, very different. But at the moment we need to understand that balance between the two. So one archetype of that is the Vesica. The Vesica represents the balance of the two. This is also represented in forms such as the middle path or the middle way of Tibetan Buddhism. Why do they emphasize the middle path? Because they know there are two polarities, and the only way to move forward is to balance the two polarities. Why do we have the form of the tree of life in the Jewish Kabbalah, where you have 3 pillars on the tree of life? One pillar, the middle pillar, goes all the way up to the top sephira of Keter and all the way down to the lowest sephira or sphere of Malkut. The left-hand pillar and the right-hand pillar, if you look at the form of the tree of life, do not go all the way to the top or all the way to the bottom. And they are referred to in some Western systems as the pillar of mercy and the pillar of severity. And so there is a particular balance of 2 polarities with the 2 side pillars, and then perfect balance with the middle pillar, the only one that connects all the way perfectly between heaven and earth. So working with this archetype, this then becomes a representation in Western spiritual history for the passion play that is depicted in the initiation document of the New Testament, describing the stages of the Passion of Christ, which have to do with an initiation process that in the school of hard knocks in the physical world every human being goes through, culminating in the crucifixion. If you read old Greek documents from pre-Christian times, Plato describes that the world soul is crucified on the world cross and on the world tree. There's a common image to many different traditions. And so this crucifixion of the world soul on the world cross has to do with the way that the cross is an emblem of the four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Every human being is crucified on the cross of the four elements in taking on a physical body. By taking on a physical body, we open ourselves up to great possible suffering. And so in some Eastern traditions, they focus on the physical plane as simply a maya. It's an illusion, so get out of here as quickly as possible. This particularly began to crystallize around the beginning of the age that we refer to as Kali Yuga in the old Indian documents, often dated in some old Indian documents to around the year 3101 BC and connected to particular stellar events. The spiritual beings that were associated with that initiative of this is a place of suffering, don't buy into the illusion, don't incarnate and discarnate permanently, were again these Luciferic beings. If you study certain types of Russian theology, there's a specific word in Russian which means a type of condescending pity. And it is the word that they use to refer to the state of awareness of these Luciferic beings when they are considering the plight of humanity. They look upon us as children who are being tortured in a type of abattoir, a type of killing ground. And so why allow these young spirits to suffer in this school? Whereas other beings of the Michaelic stream look at it as they need to go through a particular education by being here. There are portions and bits and pieces and different perspectives on this mystery all through the Western tradition, particularly once you start to read Gnostic text and you start to read what they say about the demiurge. Gnostic texts refer to the demiurge, which is the same being that was referred to by the Persians as Ahriman, then later the Egyptians referring to Set, and then Hasatan, meaning the adversary, later Satan for the Hebrew tradition. These are actual groups of spiritual beings, but they're all related to the archetype of the Vesica. One group is that understands and appreciates spirit and denies matter. The other are drawn toward matter and are literally a part of the condensation process. That is why in the Gnostic text they say that the demiurge is the lord of this world, because the spiritual blueprint, it was understood in these groups, that was created by the spirits of form, which is the spiritual hierarchy, the rank among the 9 ranks of the angels taught in the Kabbalah and in the hidden tradition in the West. The particular rank known as the Elohim, whom the Greeks call the exousiai, are known as the spirits of form. They lay down the blueprint for the physical world, which is why it says in the book of Genesis, in the beginning Elohim created the heavens and the earth. The beings that actually work with the final concretization process are the beings referred to by the Gnostics as the demiurge, by the Egyptians as the Set principle, and again this Ahriman principle for the old Persian Zoroastrians. So one way that this manifests is in that crucifixion of Christ on the cross. It is an act of unity between the solar logos and the human race. Every human being is crucified on the cross of the 4 elements by taking on a physical body, going through suffering and going through the gate of death. And so this was then done by a high spiritual being, the solar logos, in the understanding of the event in the early Christian centuries in esoteric groups. And then the way it's commonly depicted is that you see Christ crucified on the cross, and to either side there are 2 thieves. And this actually makes the form of a vesica, with a circle around one thief, of one polarity, a very different polarity represented in the other thief, and then holding a perfect balance in the center is the form of the cross holding the Christ. And if you read the story that accompanies this in the New Testament, it says that one thief said to the other that you and I deserve to be crucified, deserve to suffer, but this man, referring to Jesus, is blameless and does not deserve this fate. And he inclines his head, as you see here on the painting, toward the Christ. And in the story, he asks Christ to be taken with him into his Father's kingdom. And Christ inclines his head to him and says, "You will be with me in my Father's kingdom tonight." Whereas the other thief is represented as being completely materialistic and turns his face away from the Christ and rebukes him. So that's being represented here. Now this is then also a representation in spiritual history on the earth, a dramatization of the same concept in the Jewish Kabbalah of the 3 pillars on the tree of life, then actually created in physical space. And so to understand this event and the two polarities of the two thieves, they are representing these two spiritual polarities of spirit and matter, and then of Christ holding the balance in the center. You will also notice that at the foot of the cross is a skull. That skull is the reason why the Mount of Golgotha is called Golgotha, because the name Golgotha means the place of the skull. And that skull is the skull of Adam, the first man. And you can go ahead and switch to the next set of slides. In the original story coming out of the Old Testament into the New Testament, the first human being to fully incarnate with intact faculties is Adam. And so at the time of Adam's death, his bones are interred at the Mount of Golgotha. And then so at the time that the solar logos, the representative of humanity, this higher spiritual being that has already attained the state that humanity is meant to attain at a later state of spiritual evolution, the attainment of the Christ consciousness, of the perfect understanding of the balance of spirit and matter, that being actually incarnates, and the crucifixion of that being takes place on the literal spot of the interment of the bones of the first human being, the karma of humans incarnating on the earth. And so the cross is then established at that place at Golgotha. You might also recall that in the beginning of Saturday, I showed you a particular diagram in which it was a study of the sacred geometry of Jerusalem. And I showed you it was the same geometry as studies of the human face. There's a 6-sided enclosure and 5-pointed stars inside of it, one going up, one going down. And that there are then a spiral pattern of 5-pointed stars going into the center with its anchor at the Mount of Golgotha. So all of these are related to particular activities in spiritual history that relate to the human being, and they are related to this principle of the Vesica as a thought form in the mind of God, and the use of the Vesica both for energetic spiritual purposes and for something in sacred design and sacred architecture. It is a perfect balance point. And with it being a balance point between two opposed complementary polarities, it then becomes a portal between the worlds. One way that you see this in pre-Christian times and in pagan traditions in Europe is the Vesica as the portal of the female womb. And you will see these pictures in old churches in England of the woman holding her womb apart into a Vesica pattern so that life can pass through. So this is also one of the mysteries of the stream of the divine feminine. This is then connected to the way that there are 3 women at the foot of the cross. To hold open a triangular portal requires 3 anchor points. And so there are 3 female initiates holding that portal to the underworld at the foot of the cross. There are 3 female initiates that are sufficiently advanced to be present at the crucifixion of Christ in the story in the New Testament. There is only 1 man who is advanced enough, but 3 women. The man who is advanced enough is John, later to be the writer of the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation, according to the esoteric tradition. Elizabeth has actually done a lot of research in this field in the Jewish and Christian aspects of the divine feminine and how these things all work out. But at this point, we'll move forward and take a look at how the Vesica then becomes a template in the sacred geometric archetypes for creating the forms in the manifest world. So that today with Jane, what you looked at was the way that in the overlapping of the 2 circles of the Vesica, you have a matrix provided that by following certain very simple principles, you can then easily create a cross in the center of the Vesica, which then becomes connected to the form of a rectangle, which is perfectly the size of 2 squares. And then when you look at particular numbers that are generated by this form, if you take the baseline as 1, and then you take the diagonal of one of the squares, that diagonal gives you the square root of 2. That's the number that is generated vis-a-vis 1 as a baseline here for one side of the square. For the diagonal of both squares, using the form of a double square, that gives you the square root of 5. And taking the actual vertical line that connects the top and the bottom of the Vesica itself gives you the square root of 3. And in some aspects of the Masters of the Compass tradition, they will talk about the square root of 2 as being related to the faculty of generating physical two-dimensional space, because it has to do with that diagonal in the square in 2 dimensions. The square root of 3, they will sometimes say, is related to the generation of 3-dimensional space. And the reason for that is if you were to turn this form of the square into a cube and make a baseline of the cube 1, and then drew a diagonal line within the form of the cube, diagonal from one corner to the other, this would be the square root of 3 compared to this as 1. And so this becomes then the generation of the square root of 3, the same way as the diagonal of the square is the generation of the square root of 2 and 2-dimensional space. 2 dimensions, square root of 2. 3 dimensions, square root of 3. And then square root of 5 is sometimes said to be connected to regeneration and to the generation of life function, because the square root of 5 is directly connected to the phi ratio. And in the next couple of days, we're going to go into a lot of detail about the Fibonacci and the phi ratio, which are the particular universal harmonics that are related to animating the forms in the world with life energy. And so the living forms in the world are based around Fibonacci numbers and around the phi ratio. And those numbers are directly connected to the form of a 5-pointed star, and the 5-pointed star is a literal form of the energy circuits of the human etheric life body. We're going to look at that a little bit later, but I want to just draw some connections for you right now. So square root of 2, 3, and 5 are very important transcendental functions, all of which are generated by the Vesica. Now, one thing that we could also see inside the Vesica, and I think you did this with Jane, is that in the form of the Vesica, you can also create easily the form of a triangle. And that triangle can be broken down into 4 component triangles through a particular process, which I hope Jane did with you, and if she did not, she can do it on a later day. And that form of the triangle inside the Vesica, subdivided into the 4, actually provides not only the basis of the triangle in creation, because the triangle is the simplest form to enclose space with straight lines. You can't have a simpler balanced form with straight lines to enclose physical space. And then when you subdivide it into 4 triangles, overall triangle subdivided into 4, if you were to fold up this side and this side and this side, and they all met at the top, that would give you the form of a tetrahedron. And so it becomes what's known as the net pattern. That's the actual term they use in geometry. The net pattern, that if you were to fold it up along its edges, would create the simplest form to enclose space in 3 dimensions, the form of the tetrahedron. Again, looking at the way that the Vesica becomes the generator of the universal harmonics of the creation of the physical world and of life itself. Then you worked with Jane on working with the root rectangles. And a very interesting principle of creating the root rectangles is that starting with that initial square of creation, and let me just mention right now, in case Jane didn't mention it, that if you look at the geometry of the Temple of Solomon, as described in the Book of Kings in the Old Testament, this perfect structure, that the holy place, the hall that led to the Holy of Holies, is a double square, whereas the form of the Holy of Holies is itself one square, or actually it is a perfect cube. So starting with the basis of the square, you get your compass and put it along this diagonal, and you simply draw down an arc, and that gives you the length, with this as 1, that gives you then the length of the square root of 2. And it would then give you, if you took it as a separate rectangle, it would give you a square root of 2 rectangle, which is used in sacred design. Using this diagonal here, going now from the corner of the original square to the upper edge diagonally of the square root of 2 rectangle, and drawing the arc downward with the compass, you then get the square root of 3. Do the same procedure, and you get the square root of 4. Do the same procedure, you get the square root of 5. And so these root rectangles, square roots of 2, 3, 4, and 5, are used throughout sacred architecture. Very important principles. And let me just bring out for you the very important idea here, that what you have is the combination of the square and the circle, that not only does the Vesica generate these core harmonic principles of these 3 square roots that were referred to by Pythagoras under the idea that they were the 3 sacred roots or the 3 divine roots of all existence. But also by simply working with the straight lines of the square and the circular forms of the compass, these things are all naturally generated. So this is also connected to the mystery of the squared circle, because it's through the union of circular movement and a square base that you get every one of these rectangles created in a perfect harmonic fashion. This is a diagram of part of the Temple of Luxor in Egypt. And in the fantastic analysis of Schwaller de Lubitz in his masterwork, The Temple of Man, he shows that there are particular links that were part of the design process of the Temple of Luxor that are related directly with this as the base of 1 to the square root of 2, square root of 3, and here to the square root of 5. So the actual creation of the areas within this part of the Temple of Luxor, the southern sanctuary, is based on the Egyptians directly applying the entire series of these root rectangles from the base of 1 all the way up to the square root of 5. And this is one example of how you would use the root rectangles in the construction of a sacred space. Now there's an aspect of this that's also related to the mystery of the 3, 4, and 5. Now if I look at 1 as either a number of points or a number of lines, then I can't enclose space with the 1. And I can't do it with the 2 either. If I have 2 points or 2 lines, I can't get it to close with straight lines to enclose space. No, the minimum form that I need is the trinity. I need a 3 to be able to enclose space. And that's what I get with the form of a triangle. Then the next form I naturally come to is the 4. And now I can enclose space not in a triangle, but within a square. And the next I come to is the 5. And then I create a pentagon. Interestingly enough, when we come to the work with the Platonic solids later on, the 5 perfect divisions of the sphere, all of these perfect divisions of the sphere are based either on triangular faces, square faces, or pentagonal faces. Also, if we take this a little bit further, we'll find that the 3, 4, and 5, the triangle, the square, and the pentagon, are the foundation for all form that can enclose space. What I mean by that is before I got to the 3, I couldn't enclose space. And once I get past the 5, all I need to do is to start adding these forms together, and I can create any space. So if I want to go to the 6, I can just use 2 triangles, and I can create the 6 of a hexagon or a Star of David. If I want to use a 7, I'll use a square and a triangle. An 8, I'll simply rotate a square on a square. So the foundations of structure are the triangle, square, and pentagon, or the 3, 4, 5, when understood as a pure numerical or geometric archetype. And so the square root of 2 and the square root of 3 and the square root of 5 are directly related to these patterns. And as I'll show you in a moment, the square root of 2 generates square patterns and different patterns coming off of that. Square root of 3 generates triangular patterns and patterns coming off of that matrix. And the square root of 5 is just a bit off of the form that generates the pentagon, the pentagram, and all these types of patterns. As I believe Jane mentioned to at least one of the groups, that the square root of 5 is very close to the phi ratio, which is the generator of the pentagon and the pentagram. And that there's a numerical equation that's often spoken of in sacred geometry, where the square root of 5 plus 1 divided by 2 gives you the perfect phi ratio. They're very closely related. But understand that the square roots of 2, 3, and 5, these 3 sacred roots, are related to the generation of these shapes and all the shapes that come from them as matrices. So I want to give you some examples of that. So one way that you can think in terms of this when it's applied to sacred architecture or sacred design of any type, including of energetic systems, is that if you work the square root of 2, because it's the diagonal of the square, you can then use that to generate these types of forms that either appear square or that appear octagonal by rotating a square and a square. So when you see these types of patterns, square or octagonal forms, they are generated by the square root of 2 function. This particular illustration from the Sacred Geometry Design source book by Bruce Rawls shows you the way that you can create a root 2 series of these fractal squares one inside of the other. But if you look at this pattern, you should from this point on then be able to say this is a root 2 pattern with these types of squares upon squares and one square rotated on the other, creating an 8-sided structure, a classic root 2 pattern. And if you took this further with the rotated square on the square, then that would give you the basis to create various types of matrices. So what I'm about to show you are some illustrations coming from a book about Islamic design. So you might look on the ornate temple wall of an Islamic mosque, for example, and you would see this particular pattern. And when you would see this pattern, now you can recognize that this is a pattern that is in fact generated by the function of the square root of 2. Because what you're actually seeing here, if you were to count these points, is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And you can see that this is in fact the form of a square rotated on a square. And so square root of 2 functions, this as a background matrix, is how they generated this pattern. So you can recognize that as a square root of 2 function. Same thing here, I've got the exact same basic matrix, but all I've done is I've connected up different lines. And so by using these matrix patterns that Jane is exposing you to and you're learning how to work with, you can then use those by connecting up different parts of the matrix into all types of different designs. Here's another one that you would see in Islamic design, also based on root 2. Simply a matter of your choosing which of the lines to connect together. There's also the aspect of it that there is sometimes the use of the root 2 as a spiral form. And in the construction of the root 2 spiral, basically you've got these root 2 rectangles, one next to the other, in a constant diminishing series, although they're all actually in and of themselves a root 2 rectangle. And then you're simply connecting the points up that creates a spiral form. And later on we're going to be seeing this with the phi ratio as a very important phi ratio spiral in sacred geometry. So the square root of 3 is the next function we need to be aware of. And what the square root of 3 generates is triangular forms, and with the 2 triangles together, 6-pointed star and hexagonal forms. So when you see these types of forms, you can think this is a root 3 function. And this becomes a common language by people that do sacred architecture and design of any tradition. Someone from one tradition in one part of the world will recognize the design of someone somewhere else, and they will understand the root 2, 3, and 5 basis of the patterns. Again, from this as a matrix, this might be a pattern that you would see then in Islamic art or some other variety of sacred art or architecture. And again, you would look at it and say, okay, I see the 6-pointed star inside of it, and I've got a basic matrix that this whole pattern was generated from, that is square root of 3. This is another one that is based on a square root of 3 pattern. And again, at this point, it's beginning to get more abstract. But the more you work with them, the more you can begin to identify these different shapes as coming from these base matrices. And again, this is also connected to the way that the 2 triangles are generated by the flower pattern that you worked with on the very first day, the classic flower pattern of creation. And I should make a quick comment about this that Jane may have already commented on for you, which is that this pattern has been popularized, particularly as you go out to the next series of circles, as the flower of life. But that is not a term that is universally accepted in sacred geometry circles. It is universally accepted that it is a flower pattern because the overlapping of the circles creates these leaves on the flower. It creates the petals of the flower. However, as it turns out, a flower of life would have to be connected to the geometry of life, which is actually 5-sided or pentagonal. So a flower of life pattern would be a pattern like this that was actually pentagonal and not hexagonal, because the hexagonal structure is the structure that one sees in mineral nature. Minerals are 6-sided. And so some groups will call it not the flower of life, which is reserved for 5-sided structures related to the phi ratio and to life functions, but rather they will call it the flower of creation because of the hexagonal aspect. Here's another one that could be generated from the basic matrix of the square root of 3. Just so you start freeing up your thought process to see how the parts of the matrix can be connected together. In this case, one connects them with these wave lines. And if you then take away the matrix and just leave the wave lines that you use to connect up parts of the base diagram, you would get patterns such as this. But if you step back from it a little bit and began to examine it, you would still see that you had a base of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sides. It's simply an elaboration of a root 3 relationship. And patterns for the square root of 5 have to be based on the square root of 5, which is the diagonal line on the double square that you examined earlier. And the thing I want to bring out for you right now is that very often when you examine square root 5 relationships, which I mentioned to you before, it's just a little bit off the form of the pentagram or the pentagon. When you then see it laid out as a root 5 rectangle, what you commonly see are things like this. So you can actually identify in it very often the form of the pentagram, but it's not a perfectly balanced pentagram. It's like a slightly squashed pentagram. And this is usually a sign that you're looking at a root 5 relationship. It's close enough to the phi ratio to give you a pentagram of 5-pointed star form, but not yet close enough to the phi ratio to give you a perfectly balanced 5-pointed star. So these type of squashed 5-pointed stars are one sign of these root 5 relationships. And this is commonly used in the ancient world for architecture and for creating designs such as pottery and various types of objects. There are many texts available that talk about this as the matrix for a lot of design in the ancient world. And so this would be one matrix related to the square root of 5 that is related to creating a facade of a particular part of architecture. And again, also related to the form of the pentagram, but you have to bring other functions in as well. Here, to really generate the full form of the pentagram, you have to bring in the function of 1, because the square root of 5 plus 1 divided by 2 gives you the phi ratio. Now, an interesting thing about the square root of 5 is that there's a way that you can work with generating it, in which, let's say I've got a square, and I've divided the square up into 4 component squares, all equally sized. Now I'm going to use 2 of those squares as my root 5 angle, like you would see right here. And I'm going to then draw a compass line with it, so that I'm going to then draw the arc down to the same baseline as I started with my double square. And then I'm going to continue past up to the top, up above the top set of double squares. And if I connected that up, that would give me a larger square form. And this would be a series of what's referred to as gnomons. And this particular form is actually one that you see related to in a hidden way in a number of things in ancient Egypt. This way of working with the square root of 5 and the energetics of that, and the way it's related to creation forces, is that, for instance, if you see the cubical stone on which the pharaoh is sitting, it's related to this relationship of the squares within the form, and then it has this particular edge on the outside, the same as you have that edge created by the arc in the square root of 5 geometric drawing. Interestingly enough, this is very similar to what you find if you were to get the actual area of the bases of the 3 pyramids at Giza Plateau, and you were to get their accurately sized bases one on top of the other. You would then find that they were in a relationship the same as this. The smallest part of the 3 pyramids at Giza Plateau, the smallest of the 3 pyramids, would become this form here. Then this form here would give you the form of the pyramid of Kaffa, which then, at the latest stage of the pyramid of Khufu, or the Great Pyramid, is this form here. So their actual areas that they cover in being 3 different sizes, when you superimpose them, actually gives you this diagram. So all types of hidden relationships here that were known to the masters of the compass and the masters of the net in Egypt in creating their sacred sites. A very common form that I believe that you constructed with Jane the other day is working with the construction of the Vesica on 2 axes. And the 2 axes are then pointing toward the 4 cardinal directions. And then you can also create lines going to the cross corners. And then you have the 8 directions of space. And this is classically used in creating the foundation of a temple or a sacred space. In the classical ancient world, outside of doing the compass and straight line drawing, in laying the foundations, they would usually have a central post, and they would have a rope from it, and the particular constructions and laying out positions with the rope. But the basic idea of this being the matrix for laying out a temple is common to many traditions, particularly in India. Most Indian sacred geometry in laying out a temple has this as its fundamental structure. There's a further process that one can do with the Vesica, where just as you saw today with the Vesica, you can generate a triangle here, and you can generate a square there. You can actually take it much further. You could continue to work with the form of the Vesica, and it will provide you with the energetic information that you need to go from the triangle, which is the 3, to the square, which is the 4, to then go to the form of the pentagon, which is the 5. It will actually generate a pentagon, and then it will generate a hexagon, which is the 6. So 3, 4, 5, and 6 sided enclosures can all be generated from the Vesica as a base. 7 is not, but 8 is, so the octagon is 2. Then also 10 and 12 can be generated. So all these forms can be generated from the form of the Vesica in sacred architecture.
Robert, is there a name for that diagram, for that drawing?
Not that comes to mind immediately. Now this idea of the superimposition of multiple circles, one on top of the other, and using that as matrices for creation is something that's also been identified by people checking out the sacred geometry of the south of France. And there's been a tremendous amount of publicity in the last 15 years to Rennes-le-Château, a particular location in the south of France. But other books that have examined this and examined the particular sacred aspect of places in the south of France have found that major locations in the south of France actually all fall on points along a set of overlapping circles creating vesicas overlaid on the landscape of the south of France. And so this is showing you where various points on this pattern are existing, including Rennes-le-Château.
Are those towns? What are they?
Those are towns.
Robert, the answer for rivers is the generation of the basic polygons.
The generation of the basic polygons. And one place that that pattern you were asking about rivers is contained is in the book Order in Space by Keith Critchlow. So again, this is what we were working with before, the overlapping of the circles creating our basic pattern of the flower pattern. And that flower pattern is something that's been understood and worked with many traditions for a very, very, very long time. And you can find many types of magical amulets and things in the ancient world that were part of spiritual protection or for healing that have this pattern. You can find this in ancient Egypt, you can find it in Ethiopia, particularly throughout the Middle East and the Near East. There are many examples of this. So again, these are ways that this pattern, which is primarily a hidden pattern for the use of the masters of the compass and the masters of the net, was brought out to the public in a particular form within the amulets. Well, there's an aspect here too, if we go to a deeper level of it, getting away from the pure form of the Vesica, that the Vesica is related to the idea and the application of the polarity and the balancing of polarity in the center. So a very important concept in sacred geometry is this movement from unity to polarity to balance within the Trinity. And so within the pure polarity aspect, many traditions have a study of the polarities of creation and how they can be used, how they transform, and how they can be balanced. This is a Central American version, and of course this is the famous yin-yang of the Chinese. So that a very, very important body of knowledge for the entire world comes from the Chinese system of the I Ching. The I Ching is based on a particular type of binary progression as we go from the unity to the polarity of the yin and the yang. Then, using these aspects of yin and yang in their possible combinations in 2, you then get the next set of what are known as diagrams, where there are 2 lines. So the yin line is a broken line. The yang line is a solid line. So one way that one could think of the difference and remember it is that the yin is the receptive aspect. And so instead of being an unbroken line, the yin is broken in the center so that it can receive something into it. And so possible combinations of these basic polarities give you 4. And then if you add one more to it, going from a digram to a trigram, then you have 8 possibilities. If you were to put 2 sets of trigrams together, creating these hexagrams that are often used today in I Ching studies, then it would be 8 times 8 possibilities, giving you 64 hexagrams of the I Ching. Now, in some of the original studies of the I Ching, the studies were broken down to the basic diagrams. But what is more common today is the study of the trigrams as the foundation. And so they have particular names related to qualities of energy and manifestation in the world. Now, it's important to understand that the I Ching is referred to as the Book of Changes. The name means the Book of Changes, because these are not 64 different static states in nature. These are particular states that are constantly dynamically moving and flowing from one state to the next. I worked with one particular Qigong master of a system of shamanic Qigong from Wu Mountain in China. And he was saying that, many parts of the Chinese knowledge in America today are only partial because they look at frozen aspects of the I Ching. They don't look at the moving aspect and how it transforms from one part to another. He said from their perspective, in his particular school, that if you're looking at Chinese astrology, you cannot understand it without understanding the transformation of the energies one into the next. So it's not just a static birth chart. It's a constant, dynamic, transformative process in the person's lifetime. And the same thing for feng shui. It's constantly changing with the moving and the evolution of the hexagrams from one form to another. Well, this basic form of the I Ching then becomes a master study of 64 possible states of manifestation in a constant dynamic process that are possible on this planet. So this has numerous applications in esotericism. So it's a very valuable study for someone from any system to start looking into the deeper waters of the I Ching. Now there's another part of this too, because it relates to the basic manifestation process of polarity and how those polarities manifest in this particular process. One very obvious application of it is in any type of binary code process. So if you go to buy memory for your computer, it's all based on the same binary system. And so if you take this idea that the 1 becomes the 2, that becomes the 4, that becomes the 8, 8 times 8 gives you 64, then you'll come to 128, 256, 512. These are the numbers that you buy your memory modules for that go into your computer. If you notice, they're in these particular numbers, like 512K, that sort of thing, 512 megabytes these days. And that's because it's all based on these binary progressions. So that same logic, that same binary logic, is the foundation of computer programs and computer memory today. One very interesting aspect of this work that's come forward in the last 20 years have been studies by scientists that compare the system of the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching to the creation of the 64 sets of the codons in the DNA. And so the 64 codons of DNA are then analyzed according to the 64 forms of the I Ching. Now, interesting thing about it is that as we go from the polarity of yin and yang, and then we create the 4 out of that, and then we create the 8 out of that by going from 1 line to 2 lines to 3 lines, that it's understood that those 8 lines of the I Ching can then become the anchor points for a cube. And then that cube form that is anchored at its 8 points by the 8 trigrams of the I Ching can then be created a larger cube that contains books like this. Johnson's Jan's book on DNA and the I Ching has on its cover an actual pattern that he patented on the relationship between the I Ching and the particular building blocks of life itself with the 64 codons of DNA. There are a few other books available on this topic as well, and I list them in your handout. But this is one of the most prominent ones, DNA and the I Ching. And so as it comes together, they then are able to identify all of the different 64 hexagrams and the particular triplicate sets in the DNA process that give rise to the different amino acids. And so there's all types of embedded information in this. Now there's also a very wonderful book that I'd like to recommend that came out recently that's called Minerals for the Genetic Code. And this particular book is published by Acres USA. We had some copies out here, I don't know if we still do or not. But this book came out very recently, and Minerals for the Genetic Code has some fascinating observations about work that's been done very recently about the relationship of particular minerals. And today we are mineral starved. We have driven the minerals out of our soil, so we don't get them from the food the way we used to. But the minerals are the building blocks that actually correct problems in the DNA itself and in genetic structures. And there's a lot of incredible stuff in this book on Minerals for the Genetic Code beyond what you would think from the title. But very important information in there. And I might speak more about it at various other topics we get to along the course. Now, this idea of working with polarities, as I mentioned before, it is the absolute basis of life in this world. Our life in the manifest world is based on polarities of yin and yang, masculine and feminine. To bring new life in the world, there has to be the merging of masculine and feminine, yin and yang together. Either one alone can't do it. Then you have positive and negative poles in electricity and magnetism. And in fact, electricity and magnetism are like a polarity pair in and of themselves. They come together. When one is generated, the other comes too. You have acid and base in chemical systems. So these are the foundations of all the energetic processes in life. And so this simply demonstrates the way that you have the two polarities of magnets, and that the energies come together in particular ways. They either attract with the opposite poles or they repel with the field lines coming from the similar poles. In your handout, for those of you that are interested in healing modalities, I've given you an upshot in the beginning of your handout for these next 5 days that have to do with using polarities for healing from the perspective of different systems. And one of those handouts deals with research into the application of magnetic poles for healing from the work of Davis and Rawls. Davis and Rawls probably have done the best set of work, or the most complete set of work, in examining magnetic healing. And there's a lot of detail about their work and how it can be applied in that handout. Again, you'd want to read their books to get the full story, but the handout does make clear things about the way that we normally designate the two parts of a compass needle is actually opposite. We call the north part of the compass needle the part that points to the north, but in fact the part that would point to the north has to be the south part. So in biomagnetic studies, they actually use the exact opposite terms for north and south on the needle that you'll use with a compass that you buy at a store that you use out in the woods somewhere. So you need to know basic things like that if you're going to get into biomagnetic studies. Also, it clarifies the way that particular poles on the magnet have particular effects. One pole expands energy and one contracts. If you were to put them on two sides of the spine, of a spine that is not straight, you would need to put the polarities on the correct parts so that it is expanding on the one part and pulling toward the other place to bring the spine into its correct position, for example. And many other applications as well. One polarity can increase an infection, another can diminish it. So all of this is described in this particular handout. So this work with polarity has many different manifestations, one of which is magnetic, but also has manifestations in things like the polarities of the human body. And so there's the polarity system of polarity healing developed by Randolph Stone. And polarity healing system is actually based on a lot of things that Randolph Stone picked up living and working in India. So I have a short part of the handout as well dealing with polarity healing and its basic concepts in the work of Randolph Stone. I also have a part of the handouts for you in the set that deal with polarity according to the esoteric work of a great Hermetic healer and scholar named Franz Bardon. Franz Bardon wrote a series of very interesting Hermetic texts that are classics in the field. His most famous text is called Initiation into Hermetics. And very advanced Hermetic adept in Europe. I believe he actually comes from Czechoslovakia, although he operated throughout Europe. And he had terrible experiences in World War II where he was captured and tortured by the Nazis, but he survived the war. Anyway, in his works, like Initiation into Hermetics, he studies the polarities in different parts of the human body. And he talks about the way that these polarities come together in particular types of energetic work and in spiritual work. and the polarities that are operative in his type of hermetic initiation. And he also mentions there that there's in fact not only the dual system of north and south, but there are actually polarities within that, creating a four-part system that he calls a quadrupole magnet, and that those four parts of magnetic energy are directly related to the concept of Yod-He Vav-He, the divine name of God, which encloses this information about the quadrupole magnet in initiation. But again, I've written it all up in the handout for you, so we won't spend more time on it here, but know that that exists in your papers. In the biogeometry course, we spoke at one point about this aspect of the early French energy research with the work of a man named Louis Turenne. And Louis Turenne was one of the people that first began to examine the different qualities of energy and break the qualities of energy up into the different bands that we use today in biogeometry, for example. Now, there are particular tools that Louis Turenne developed to be able to test different energy waves that cannot be picked up by electromagnetic equipment. And in fact, some of his tools are very effective, and they're a bit complex to learn, which is one reason we don't use them in the basic biogeometry training, but they can reveal a lot of energetic phenomena that's hard to pick up any other way. So one very interesting tool of Louis Turenne's that is described in some of the translations from Jane Weaver, where she translated Turenne's works into English, is a particular tool that he developed in which, using as a pendulum a basic form of a sphere, he then would get two compass needles and he would mount them on either sides of the sphere, and then clearly marking which poles were which on the needles, depending on how you aligned the two needles horizontally or vertically, or one horizontal and one vertical, or both polarities going the same direction, or the polarities going in two opposite directions. You could actually test different types of energy qualities, and you could pick up different types of energy waves. This is a more complex part of testing the energetics off of shapes and forms, and the energetics that make up our world that Turenne talked about. But it's a very interesting idea. He's now applying the polarities of the magnets along with directionality for vertical waves and horizontal waves in nature to be able to differentiate very subtle energetic phenomena that most people have never even thought about. So this is a very interesting concept and something to explore for those of you into energetic research.
Did Christopher Hills work with that?
Yes, he did. Christopher Hills did work with that at one time. That's right. Christopher Hills is one of the few people in North America that knew the French research. And as you might be aware, we were fortunate enough to purchase his entire library from his widow a couple of years ago. And that's been some of the texts that Jane has been translating. So I mentioned before that not only is electricity a polar system of positive and negative polarities, and is magnetism, but the two are themselves connected. And many different types of phenomena where you have an electrical field, it will generate a magnetic field at an orthogonal rotation, which, if you remember from our first day, is a big $10 word to make academics feel special. Orthogonal rotation is just a 90-degree angular shift. And so you classically have electrical fields and magnetic fields appearing together, but at two different axes at 90-degree rotation from each other. It's another aspect of the polar creation of the world. Now, for those of you that are into the deeper waters of esoteric energy research, and particularly into what's known as free energy research, there is an interesting body of work that has to do with zero-point energy. And I don't know if it's still out there or not, but we had a few books by Moray King dealing with zero-point energy and some of its concepts. And there's also relationships of zero-point energy to what's known as scalar energy. In fact, there are different names that are used by people doing free energy research and esoteric energy research that many of them are closely connected. Scalar energies, free energy, zero-point energy, torsion fields is a term that the Russians use. They all have to do with these particular subtle energetic phenomena, and if you begin to study their works, in almost every case it comes down to geometry. It's the geometry of something they're creating that allows these energies to be manifested in a machine or to be used for some purpose. And so if you want to look at how they are now generating what's known as scalar energies, and classically what a scalar energy is, which some of you are familiar with, and you hear this as a jargon term in a lot of advanced energy research, A scalar energy is an energy that has a magnitude in an area, but it does not have a vector of directionality. In other words, it's not propagating out in a direction in physical space the way that electromagnetic waves normally do. It has an energy quality to itself, but it's like instead of traveling out in physical space, it's somehow going in or out of some other place that's not in three-dimensional space. This was a very important concept for Nikola Tesla. Nikola Tesla said that the electromagnetic energies that we use in our modern technology are in fact what he called retarded waves. When the experimenter Hertz put his name onto Hertzian waves that we use today in electromagnetic technology, Tesla shook his head and said that we're going to lose all understanding of electricity and magnetism because the only thing that are being called Hertzian waves are retarded waves, waves that are slower than the speed of light. But the scalar waves are faster than the speed of light and actually work with some different principles. But that got completely thrown out of the electromagnetic technology and textbooks in later times.
Robert, have you heard just the term subtle energy used as a reference like scalar waves, or are they always differentiating those two terms?
Very commonly, subtle energy is used as just a blanket term, and without more clearly differentiating. Usually they use the term subtle energies for anything that cannot be picked up by electromagnetic monitoring device. So one of the things that you find in working with the zero-point energy and scalar energy generation is that they'll build a particular type of coil. And these are two of the coils that are used in scalar energy research. One is what's known as a caduceus coil, where the two wires are crossed over each other like this, like a caduceus. And this is also similar to what you find in the Slim Sperling tools, where he winds the two wires around each other in this type of helix fashion. Another type that you find is something called a bifilar coil. In these, the coils are wound around so that one is directly above the other. And the idea of this is that the currents that are generated in these two, when they're crossing over, or they are one on top of the other, is that the currents buck one against the other. And in the bucking of the two currents, the energy doesn't necessarily propagate out into physical space, but it creates a kind of a pressure point in space-time. And it connects to something that's not in three-dimensional space, which can in some cases lead to a release of excess energy. And so there's a lot of different concepts about this and dealing with bringing energy from what they're referring to as hyperspace. And if you look on the internet, you can find different information about these types of technology, particularly if you look up the work of Tom Bearden. Tom Bearden is a person that's worked a lot with scalar wave generators and scalar wave detectors. And Bearden is B-E-A-R-D-E-N, Tom Bearden. Next. So again, a very important concept for us is the way that energy will move out from the center outward and from the periphery moving inward. We've explored this in multiple ways so far in the course, including in eurythmy, as well as in our various concepts. And it's a concept that's going to keep coming up for us at different times and taking different manifestations. It's a core part of the creation process. And one aspect of that I mentioned to you before is the way that etheric life energies will ray in from the circumference of the world around us toward a center. And this is related to some work in projective geometry. The other day you did a project with Jane where you drew lines and you were able to create forms in the way that the lines came together to create an enclosure. So in projective geometry, it has to do not just with basic mathematical and geometric concepts in what's called non-Euclidean geometry, but it has to do with the basic process of how life forces stream in from the cosmos to the earth and construct things here in the world. That's one reason why Rudolf Steiner and the Rosicrucians working with Steiner have done a lot of work with projective geometry, because they understand it's related to etheric life forces streaming toward the earth. And so they'll do these types of diagrams showing these forces streaming in from all these different directions, creating a matrix blueprint for the creation of living forms, such as this leaf. Or in this case, with the lines raying in from multiple directions, creating crystalline forms like minerals, with the idea being that if something like a crystal is growing, that form that the crystal takes with its hexagonal geometry is not formed purely from what's inside of it, but it's also taking its form by the forces coming from the outside that are impressing the shape upon it. Now there's a very important concept here also related to polarity, which is that of inversion. And if you read some older occult texts, they will often talk about this principle of inversion, and they will use the metaphor of a glove turning itself inside out. And they use this principle of inversion and the glove turning inside out to describe the relationship between the spiritual world and the physical world. That the spiritual and physical worlds are very similar to each other, but they're the exact opposite. One of them is inverted compared to the other. It's like something turning itself inside out. One way this is sometimes described as an esoteric example is that while we are incarnate in a physical body, I experience the forces streaming from the planets inside of me as my internal organs. And this is that whole Hermetic analogy of the way the organs are derived from the forces of the planets. So now inside of me, in my body, I feel those organs. Whereas after death, it's like I'm turned inside out, and I experience the planets in the solar system the same way that I experienced the organs in my body while I was incarnated. So this inversion process is very important, and you find innumerable examples of it in different esoteric texts, particularly classical texts. A lot of classical knowledge has been lost today, and you just don't see it in esoteric teachings or text anymore. Even stuff from the turn of the last century. But it's very important ideas. Another important idea is about this inversion process between the physical and spiritual planes, where things will appear literally reversed. And so one thing that you would find in some turn of the century texts is describing perceiving things in the astral light. And in the astral light, the number 531 might appear to you as 135. And things that you're actually sending out away from you energetically might appear to you as if they're coming toward you. And so one description of this is that a person going through severe drug withdrawal or DTs of some kind might actually be sending out from themselves some pretty nasty stuff, but they perceive it as something terrible moving toward them, these terrible, horrific images moving toward them. They're actually being projected out from them, but they see it as moving in toward them. So all types of inversion processes like this occur. You will also find on the temple walls in ancient Egypt pictures of the initiate being led toward the spiritual world and standing there looking. And he has to figure out why there are figures standing up here, and directly beneath them is the same figure reversed upside down beneath it. Understanding that inversion process, you see that on the Egyptian temple walls. So let me show you another idea related to inversion, because it's not just between the physical and spiritual worlds, although that definitely happens. And it's also a very important idea for the Rosicrucians in understanding the relationship between the physical energies, or the physical realm, and etheric life energies. Part of it is actually one being turned inside out from the other. But this also occurs in the creation of the physical world with polarities. So I'll give you a very direct example that you're all familiar with, and that is this reciprocal polarity relationship with human beings breathing in oxygen and breathing out carbon dioxide. Then the plants breathe in the carbon dioxide and they release oxygen. It's a perfect symbiotic relationship between the two. And again, it's also a polarity process. But interestingly enough, that polarity process also exists in the actual spatial form or the geometry of the organs of respiration for the plant and for the human being. So if you look at the organ of respiration for the plant, it's outside of itself with the branching of the branches and the leaves on the outside, and it takes a particular type of fractal form. Whereas in the human being, the exact same form is inside, but the branches into the openings in the lung are then literally the form that you see on the trees, which is on the outside, is now inverted and turned inside out. So what is actually solid in physical space with a physical branch and a physical twig and a physical leaf on the outside here is now not only turned inside out as the exact shape and form inside the human being, but also it is now an empty or hollow space. What was solid here is now empty here, and those branches of the lungs are now empty open space. A very important example of this principle of inversion in the creation of the physical world and polarity relationships for how life works, because life operates as a pulsation. When you check a person's pulse and there's no more pulse, they're dead. The the faculty of breathing in and out, of the heart beating. These things are all directly related to that pulsation of polarity of life that need to be perfectly balanced. And I'll give you one other example of this, and that is this principle of the Mobius strip. Mobius strip becomes a very interesting geometric example of something turning itself inside out in a circuit. Because as you see here, with a square riding the outside of a Mobius strip, this is a two-dimensional being on that surface. You start here, and they're starting on the outside, but the Mobius strip has that half a turn. So if you took a piece of paper and gave it half a turn, and then put it together, that gives you the form of a Mobius. So he's starting on the outside, and then all of a sudden, he hits the twist, and you see the look on his face, and it's like, whoa, how did I end up on the inside? And then it goes through a complete 360 circuit on the inside, and then all of a sudden he's on the outside again. So that twist of the Mobius strip of taking a circuit ride on the outside, then all of a sudden, whoops, I'm taking the ride on the inside, whoops, I'm back out on the outside, is also a description esoterically of the incarnation process. All of a sudden, I'm flying around in the spiritual world, what happened to my body? And then before you know it, I got stuck in another body, and whoops, I'm back on the outside. Then, whoop, I got hit by the truck, and now I'm back on the inside. So it's a geometric archetype of that whole process, that entire movement, and how the two work together. All righty. It is just now 5 o'clock. I'll take the lights on, and I'll take a few quick questions, and then we're going to be done for the day. So the principle of this talk had to do with the Vesica as the balancing of polarities and the universal harmonics of the three sacred roots that come out of it, and then the basic principle of polarity in creation and the different forms that it takes. So any questions or comments that anybody has? Yes, please.
Well, I'm kind of confused about the inversion thing, because it looks a lot like mirroring. Can you distinguish between inversion and mirroring?
Inversion and mirroring, it can take both forms. It can take the mirroring aspect that we talked about, like with 135 appearing as 531.
Yeah.
And it can also take the literal inversion aspect, like a glove turning itself inside out, that you saw between the branches of the tree and the open spaces within the human lungs.
Well, because, yeah, with 153 versus 13, I can't even say it, but if it was inversion, it would be reciprocals. 1/5, 1/3, not the reverse order of the numbers. That to me is inversion. So I'm trying to get hung up there. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Kind of.
Huh?
Kind of. We'll talk about it more.
Okay.
Yes, please.
On the drawing of the cathedral, where the Vesica was around the Christ figure,
Yes.
there were a number of tetrahedrons shown, inverted and, well, to each other. There was one drawing that showed them juxtaposed perfectly, which looks like the drawing I've seen what they call Merkaba. Is that an actual figure that actually exists in creation with the solids?
Absolutely. The form that is popularly known as the, well, let's start from the beginning. The concept of the Merkaba is a concept coming from early Jewish Kabbalism, and then became a series of texts by what's known as the Hekaloth school around the 2nd century AD. This was a branch of the Kabbalistic school that specialized in directly applying Kabbalistic ideas to direct initiation processes, and particularly to conscious travel through higher worlds. And you can actually find translations of these early Jewish texts. None of them refer directly to the actual geometric shape of the Merkaba. Rather, they refer to the Merkaba where the term Merkava in Hebrew is actually a term coming from the root rachev, which means to leave one's normal place and travel in Hebrew. And it's related to the term Merkava that you see in the vision of Ezekiel in the Old Testament and the ascent of Elijah to heaven, in which in those depictions they talk about these people ascending to heaven on the Merkava, which is then understood as being a chariot and depicted as a chariot of fire in some of the Old Testament text. So it's some type of vehicle for travel in higher worlds in those earlier texts. Then material began to come out, and the term Merkaba or Merkava became repopularized in the US in the 1970s through the text The Keys of Enoch with J.J. Hurtak. Then it reached even more exposure with the work of Bernard Perona, aka Drunvalo Melchizedek, with his Flower of Life workshop in the 1980s. And he taught a form of the Merkaba that was a bit different from what was taught by Hertog, in which he depicted the form of the Merkaba as what's known as a star tetrahedron. So that's the background. The star tetrahedron is basically one tetrahedron up, one tetrahedron down, creating an interlocked form. That is a form that you will find if you connect up points within a cube. A cube has 8 spaces. If you want to make a cube so that if you made it a flexible cube, that it would actually be supported and not fall down, you would put that form inside of it, of the 2 tetrahedra. And it's actually important that it's related to that form of the cube. So that form of the star tetrahedra is known classically as the stella octangula, because it's based on creating a stellation or a star form off of the base of a octahedron. Because what you basically do is you take every face of the octahedron, and from the center you draw out a point. So now you have a point out on all 8 faces. You stellate it into a star, and that gives you the form of the star tetrahedron. This particular form of the star tetrahedron does exist in different energetic applications, and one of the backgrounds to the work that was popularized as the Merkaba with the star tetrahedron can be found in the work of Rudolf Steiner from about 60 years previously. And at that point, he was talking about the way that in the classical Western tradition, the form energetically of the human etheric body is related to a 5-pointed star. The classic 5-pointed star like this is an etheric circulation. Then the form of the human astral body is related to a 6-pointed star. And we're going to go into more detail on this, and I've got slides for this on probably Thursday. And so I'll go into some more about this, and you'll see the pictures accompanying what I'm telling you right now. But the basic idea of it is that that 6-pointed star form is simply a 2-dimensional view of it. And to make a long story short, that we'll talk about more when we get to it in a couple of days, the upshot of it is that the star tetrahedron form is one aspect of the human astral body. It is one form the human astral body of consciousness takes. Well, there are other forms as well, so that there's also an egg-shaped auric form and other forms that are part of the human astral body functioning. So what was then brought out to the public as the Merkaba is one part of the human subtle bodies, and that part is accurate. But what was left out of it were the other geometric aspects that I believe was an original part of the understanding of the Kabbalistic school, and then with their offshoot of the Hekeloth school with the Merkaba writers. So that I think is an authentic piece of the puzzle, but it's only one part of the original initiation knowledge of all the patterns. Because if we think of this in the way that it's often described in modern terms as an ascension vehicle, that actually all the different subtle bodies are involved in higher spiritual knowledge and travel. And so part of this is the transformation of these subtle bodies to a higher form. So again, this is one part of that system, but there's more to it. And I would make one little side comment, and that is that if you take a look at some of the old Egyptian hieroglyphics, you find that 2 primal forms in ancient Egypt for what we think of as the human etheric life body and the human astral body are what they call the Ka and the Ba. And if you take a look at these Egyptian texts related to the term love in Egypt was the prefix Mer. And so Merkaba, as far as pure seed sounds in ancient Egyptian, would mean the force of love transmuting the human life body and the human astral body into a vehicle of higher consciousness and travel. The thing with this is that a Jewish Kabbalistic scholar will not accept that interpretation, which, by the way, is my interpretation. I haven't found it in any text, but just by studying ancient Egyptian, those are the sounds. But in Kabbalistic studies with the Kabbalistic word, the sound itself has some meaning. So again, what I would say as a wrap-up for that, and we'll get to it in more detail with some slides in a couple of days, is that that is an authentic pattern for one part of the human energy field, but it's part of a larger system of patterns too. Yes, please.
I have 2 questions. One is, can you speak about the shape of the egg, the ovoid, as it relates to the shape of the sphere? And the other question is, real early, was today. You've got a picture of the grand unified theory. And I'm just wondering if there's any connection you're making between the 5 forces and BG3?
Let's see. The 5 forces of unified theory and the BG3, no, I'm not making any direct connection. I'll tell you one theory that I have, and this is not coming from Dr. Karim, this is just coming from me with my Hermetic connections. This is just me. So, and that is that from my examination of the appearance of these 3 energies and their functions, they appear to me to be related to primal forces that are at the core of the human energy body, of the human consciousness body, and of the human divine essence. Now what I mean by that is that one is the negative green carrier wave. And if you take a look at its function, it's to transmit energy and information. Well, that's the function of the etheric. And so the etheric life function seems to be mirrored there in what we're then identifying in the center of the circle as the function of the negative green. Then the second element is the higher harmonic of ultraviolet. The next body of the human being, seen from a 4-fold perspective that we described before, is the astral body. And when we did our little process the other day and we went through the layers, at the furthest layer we come to, at the astral level, we see this dark purple light. And in fact, when I started working with Dr. Karim, I recognized his description of the higher harmonic of ultraviolet as the spiritual light in the atmosphere of the angels as being the same thing as this particular light. It is the spiritual light because it is the light that you perceive in these different spiritual practices. So from my perspective, if I worked with a particular Himalayan master, they would focus on my being able to perceive it directly in the third eye space. Whereas from this Egyptian school, they work to objectify it from the outside, to be able to test and manifest its energy quality through particular means. So one's more introverted, one's more extroverted. But it's the same thing. So higher harmonic of ultraviolet, for me, is the core energy behind the astral. Then the final one is the higher harmonic of gold, and described in biogeometry as the plane of divine wisdom. And so that gold essence is what is classically connected to the I am self-awareness, the divine spark. And even the Egyptians say this is the highest of the 3 elements. And so negative green, I would see as connected to the core of the etheric. The higher harmonic of ultraviolet to the core of the astral. Higher harmonic of gold to the core of the I am presence, or the spiritual core. And so there's a reason why you would find all 3 in the center of the circle, and why all 3 are what balance living energetic systems and those particular functions. Again, that's just my view, not necessarily Ibrahim's. He might agree with certain parts of it. Like he will say definitely multiple groups know about these energies, particularly about higher harmonic of ultraviolet and the spiritual light, etc. But that particular interpretation is simply my own. Now the other question, again, about the particular form of the ovoid vis-a-vis the circle, or the sphere, is something we're going to get more into tomorrow. Because the upshot of it, we're going to find, from my perspective, when I did this work of trying to identify what are the core patterns in sacred geometry and what are their functions, that the egg-shaped auric enclosure, or the egg shape in nature as a form of the egg, whereas in a mammal you find the egg in the womb in a more spherical form. In some other creatures they have more of the literal egg when they lay an egg. One thing that we're going to see is that the actual form of the egg in its geometry is the complementary geometry, the exact opposite, but complementary to the form of a double vortex. That the double vortex hourglass type form has its complementary shape in the form of the egg. And we're going to see that an egg-shaped form will actually generate a vortex. Like if you put an egg shape in water and the water runs by it, it'll spin the water into a vortex after it. And the egg-shaped auric enclosure of a human being fits into the vortices of higher worlds to move from one location to the next. So I'll leave it at there for the moment, and we'll call it a day. Thank you all.